and welcome back to Thunderquack Perfect 10, the podcast where we explore the pop culture masterpieces we love. I'm your host, Michael Cohen. You might be asking yourself, what exactly is a perfect 10? Simply put, a perfect 10 is a piece of pop culture media we love unconditionally. This isn't about review scores, it's about pure joy, because everything around here is a 10 out of 10 to us. It's time to wake up from cryo sleep and do what's best for the company because we're talking the 2024 sci-fi horror film Alien Romulus with Wythe Marschall, creator of the political science fiction tabletop role-playing game Stillfleet. Wythe, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, what's up? Thanks for having me, Michael. It's really good to be here. I love talking about aliens and I love talking about role-playing games. So this is it. This is life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you are going to be new to our podcast audience. I've got a pretty a stable a rotation of guests on Perfect 10 that I think people have gotten used to. But you're a new voice, and the reason for that is because we're working on a project together, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I if people don't know you, which most of our audience I don't think is going to. You are the creator of something called Stillfleet, which is a tabletop role playing game, and we're working on some Stillfleet stuff.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it was like, oh, cool. Well, we're getting ready to launch this backer kit. Let's take an opportunity to talk about it, and then we'll do it on Perfect 10, where we can also then talk about something super nerdy and geeky and get way deep into it.
Yeah,
um
and relevant and I think inspirational, right? I think that's the main tie
yeah,
from what I understand of kind of the initial setup of just what are some things that filter into this role-playing game so it crosses over with your audience because I also watch movies.
yeah.
While I'm an unfrozen caveman and mostly read books, I do really love movies. So I think the Alien movies are such a big influence, and it's a really just great chance to kind of lean back and shoot the stuff about them.
Yeah, yeah,
But I'm happy if
absolutely.
you want to introduce myself, given while I may be
Yeah.
incredibly famous in America, I realize Canadians listening may not have heard of me. So I don't know. No, I'm not. I'm nobody. So, I'm happy to sort of do that spiel if that's something that would be useful.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, you can kind of give your background a little bit, and then we'll get into to Stillfleet specifically. But yeah, yeah,
Sure.
introduce yourself for sure.
Sure. So my name's Wythe, and I'm a writer of various things, but my focus is on the future of the life sciences. So I'm a science communicator. I work in marketing. I'm a researcher, and mostly what I prefer to do and spend a lot of time doing, not always lucrative, but sometimes, is writing games. So physical games, tabletop role playing games, story games about essentially science fiction and politics. So I'm also a leftist. I'm a socialist here in New York City, and yeah, I think that tabletop role playing games are a really great way to connect with people and talk about all sorts of fraught, interesting, messed up topics, and still have a bunch of fun goofing off and laughing with your friends. And you get to roll some dice, which are, for some reason, everyone loves that kind of haptic, like, I don't know what number's going to come up, moment. So it creates that moment of like leaning in. Everyone's at the table, not sure what's going to happen, including the referee, right? The game manager. So yeah, I'm a lifelong GM and creator of content for games. But I started publishing them more recently around the COVID-19 pandemic's outbreak, when friends who had been playing the game that became Stillfleet for a long time pushed me to publish that, and so that became my first game where I put myself out there and said, okay, I make games in addition to doing more. Adult sounding science writing about food and medicine. But yeah, so those are kind of my beats. I write about the future of food and medicine, and I make games. And now with my friends, I have a company called the Stillfleet Studio. And so, yeah, we're partnering, Michael, with you on this new quick start for Stillfleet that is kind of the cartoony, comic booky intro to the game through a different lens, like a different look and feel, but it's the same game and still brings up a lot of the same themes. And I think it's timely, and we'll get into sort of politically how writing this in the era of like Trump's second presidency here in the U.S.
Hmm.
Has like influenced some of those thoughts, which are really at the heart of the game from the beginning. I mean, it's a game about malingering and doing a politics within the kind of the core, right? That like you're one of the bad guys, right? You're a space marine, and you realize maybe you shouldn't be doing that. So it's I think it's a game very much inspired by Alien, and that sort of idea of like you work for Wayland Utani, but
Mhm.
that's not a good thing. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's
Yeah.
satirical, but it opens the door to a lot of just really really fun, weird cosmic fantasy. So like really far future sci-fi exploration. And yeah, it's really nice to be able to work with other artists. I love collaborating. So again, thanks Michael for kind of reaching out and pitching us on just a really fun, zany, new way into the game. So happy to be here and talk about both Alien and Stillfleet, and I'm sure other stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, so normally we only have one topic, right? But we're kind of talking Stillfleet, and then we're going to talk about aliens. So I figured that we would give Stillfleet the same treatment that we do whatever other pop culture thing we're talking about. So I have prepared a primer that I think will help people understand Stillfleet as well, and then yeah, and then let's get into like nitty gritty details of Stillfleet as well, because I want to talk to you about that.
Sure. Yeah.
But let me really quickly just read this out. So Stillfleet is a politically charged tabletop role playing game set in the wild and distant future. Playing as a void miner, a salvager working for the worshipful company of Stillfleeters, you and your crew explore the far reaches of outer space, encountering alien creatures, cosmic horrors, and beings from a future even farther flung than your own. It's hard sci-fi with over double the doctor recommended dosage of weird. That's my summation of it.
That's great.
Yeah, and I mean it's a role playing game, so I the easiest analog is always Dungeons and Dragons. Thankfully, in the last 5-10 years, D&D has become fairly ubiquitous and just a common part of the vernacular thanks to Stranger Things. So people understand that you take these math rocks and you throw them, and numbers come up, and then that tells you if things are good or bad. But that's just sort of the basics of tabletop role playing. And then each system that exists out there, they have different purposes, different reasons for existing. And I for Stillfleet, you created your own system. It's actually it's similar in that you roll dice, and then numbers come up, and then that gives you an indicator of the result, which is the fundamentally the same as Dungeons and Dragons, and
Right.
other tabletop role playing games, but the grit system is fairly distinct, in that I think it falls more in line with narrative based mechanics than it does with um, tactical mechanics, which is I like those are sort of the distinctions that I make when it comes to game design. Of like D&D is very tactical. It has a lot of narrative components to it, and especially in fifth edition they've started, and with this new one that they started rolling out last year, there's a lot more of that in it, and I think that's just wizards sort of riding the cultural wave at the moment, because narrative games, I think, in the last 10 years, 10-15 years, have really started to take over the space a lot. So mechanics that are more about like, here's a general idea of the outcome. Now players and the GM, as you referred to, the referee, right? Flesh that out, and what does that actually look like, right? So the grit system to me is a great way of actually almost blending the two, because there are some very technical things in the grit system, but really the foundation of it is so simple and so easy to get, and then it's a matter of what game you're playing and how it's using that system. And with Stillfleet, it comes down to the powers, right? Like it comes down to whether or not you're going to go deep with something with a character who's got like hell science powers, or you're going to keep it more simple with like a banshee or something like that, right? But I maybe you can explain a little bit more about the grit system and how you came up with it, or more important to me, I think, is like the why of it, like why the grit system as opposed to the traditional D20, skills and abilities sort of system that a lot of games use.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And we get this question a lot, but yeah, in short, you said it well. I mean, traditionally the games, tabletop games grew out of D20 mechanics. So you have a range from 1 to 20 for most roles, and that's a really large range. And it frankly makes
Mhm.
things feel super random. And when you're lower level, when you're supposed to be a hero, you're actually kind of bad at everything and fail a lot. And it just, the games are very focused. They came out of wargaming, right? D&D came out of chainmail, which came out of war games, like miniatures games, and sort of simulating combat with D6s and later D20s, and these big ranges where it's all about killing goblins and minotaurs and whatever. And that's fine, but I think there's a lot better ranges with um, different dice types. So we
Mhm.
just kind of got rid of the d20 and use all the other dice and just have your scores as the dice, which is an innovation I think works really well. Not a lot of systems have done, but I think more will, because it just is very natural. It's like, oh right, if I have a d12 in combat and I'm rolling at someone with a D8 in movement, they could jump out of the way, but it's more likely more of the time I'm going to shoot them before they jump out of the way, right? But it's like then you can create powers that very simply like give advantage or disadvantage. So you can, I could roll twice or they could roll twice, get the better result. You always fail on a 1. So again, if you have a really small dice, that can be a huge problem because you're just more likely to auto fail, right? If you get the 1. And I always make ones, you fail with, or you sort of succeed in a bad way, right? Like
Mhm.
you do get out of the way, but you still take damage because you jump into, there's actually like an alien crab like larva over there where, in the closet you're hiding. And you always succeed if you're rolling the maximum, which is really fun. It's fun to roll a d20 and get a 20, but it only happens once in a while. So with the other dice types, again, you get more of that variability and kind of swings that feel better tied to like, okay, how good am I supposed to be in whatever we're simulating, right? So in Stillfleet, it's far future. In our other games, it's different settings. But in each case, it's like we can assign different dice to the scores. It's just a question of like how good is someone at something. To
Yeah.
your point about the powers, that's a kind of whole different journey that I mean, I was really influenced by as a kid Werewolf and Vampire, which had a different take. They were still pretty gritty and tactical in a lot of ways. If you think about rolling d10s and when you're fighting, especially in Werewolf, it was like D&D, like you're spending a
Mhm.
lot of time doing math. With Powered by the Apocalypse, when that came out, when Apocalypse World came out, that really blew my mind because the powers were written as like fait accompli scenes almost. Like, okay, you use this power and like a thing just happens. And
Mhm.
that completely changed my like design philosophy as a GM just with friends. And that led to eventually, the grid system in terms of how the powers are created, which is, pretty much when you do them, things tend to just happen. It could be a simple thing. So the next time you roll, you're rolling with advantage or whatever. But often it's more narrative, to your point. So it's like, the Banshee has the power dive. So the sort of engineer scientist character can get everyone away to safety and just end combat by fiat. It's costly and dangerous because it could represent like along the way you're getting shot at or whatever. Um, you accidentally enter an area of the Hulk that has been breached and there's no Atmo and whatever. You can imagine all the fun of the narrative moment, but it is like that scene that happens. So that is a kind of power that we came up with. But I came up with Stillfleet, and now again we have other games with other designers. But that's actually not all of them. I mean, a lot of them are. I think of it as kind of in between Powered by the Apocalypse and the D20 games, where the D20 games are so much about second by second tactical like knife fights,
Yeah.
and Powered by the Apocalypse tends to be these big fait accompli scenes where you use a power and it kind of radically shifts. This game is, all our games are meant to be played to me at a more like improv, natural storytelling um, pace where, you want to do something big every round that's actually fun and meaningful. So most of the powers function in that way, where like one, like you're saying, the hell signs, like our equivalent of psionics or magic in Stillfleet, the idea that humans have evolved some ability to like control quantum probabilities with their thoughts. A lot of those powers are really, really weird and they have big effects and, use them, they just happen. So maybe, again, typical things you could sort of, other games have like a charm person. So we have powers that let you puppet someone else, control their actions for a limited amount of time. And there's certain ways this can be resisted and whatnot, but a lot of them are written as like, yeah, this thing happens, it's happening in real time, and it allows players to stop and kind of have a lot of agency and lean into like what kind of character they are, to your point, like what kind of cool futuristic weird, just really weird person am I. And I think that's sort of a in between. Like I really like, and I'm inspired by a game that kind of came out in parallel with Stillfleet called Ultraviolet Grasslands. And I just reread it because I was like, man, I really want to go back. Like I know this is a good game. I haven't really played it in a while. And his whole thing is like you get in skills and abilities that are just like single sentence. Like you make up whatever you want. You have, plus to rolling a d20 to that thing. And that's really wide open and really fun, but it is to me a little less constrained in the sense of okay, but if you want to dive in, like what is the archetype? Like it makes the player do more, it's a more cognitive burden up front, which is totally fine for like veteran players. But with Stillfleet, I wanted to create that almost like you're given your dossier by your boss, like go off and do a space marine thing, right? And you have a type of character you are. And so lean, we're kind of again halfway between the playbook approach of Powered by the Apocalypse, where you're given like a finished kind of pre-generated character, and the openness of like Dungeons and Dragons or UVG, where you make everything from scratch and it's very like detailed. So we wanted
Mhm.
to have a sort of in between level of narrative, narrative focus, if that makes sense. And yeah, the numbers I think work better. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but we play these games all the time. They're super fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of what I really love about the grit system is the ease of picking it up, right? So whether it's, looking at the powers and going like, oh, okay, cool. So like a thing kind of just happens, right? We don't have to do a bunch of math. Some of the powers are even, like sort of circumvent the math, right? Like that's one of the fun aspects of it when you're looking at the classes and the species and stuff like that. But that ability to just like sort of like like grok the system a little bit faster than something like D20, where like D20 is, okay, I have an ability score, and that ability score has a modifier, and that modifier is going to apply to certain roles under certain circumstances.
Right.
And so like you're abstracting something that is already abstract, and I love D20. Like I love D&D. I've been playing it forever, but it is one of those things of like, yeah, like you do end up spending a lot of time doing math, and the strategy of like what is my character going to do in this circumstance, especially in combat, oftentimes has more to do with the math than it does with the role playing.
Right.
And so my experience, my anecdotal sort of vibe of D&D is that you end up in combat way more often than other games, and everybody ends up basically min-maxing whether they intended to or not. Even somebody like me who hates min-maxing, like I end up min-maxing in combat, mostly because I just want to get out of combat. Like I'm just like, no, I'm a
Right.
bard. I don't want to be here. Can we get back to some diplomacy? And I want to talk somebody's pants off or something, right? Like that's what I'm here for. But with the grit system, both in just the simplicity of like of sort of just roll those dice and then success versus failure sort of thing, but also in the assigning of your scores, where you have an array of dice, right? You have this pool of numbers, and like you're saying, it's less about a gauge or a meter saying I'm this good at the thing, and it's more about the probability of success versus failure on a given skill check, which I think is much more organic. It's much more sort of naturalistic of yeah, like I am more likely to do this well because I am trained in doing this, rather than somebody who is untrained. And D&D accomplishes the same thing, kind of, but like you were saying, when you're rolling everything on a D20, the spread of results is so much wider.
Right.
um
Yeah. And like I
and
would argue like in D&D and even UVG, like the OSR games, so the old school Renaissance or old school revival games which take D&D and try to simplify it or extend it,
hmm,
they still have the same problem of like I said, like does it, how often are you going to use some really specific check that doesn't have a narrative oomph. It doesn't do anything
yeah.
immediately. It's just giving you a small bonus, and you have to keep track of a bunch of small bonuses or penalties, as opposed to having powers that like always do something in the moment that is kind of narratively clear. And then so you have, you only have 5 scores, they're different die types, and those are your checks, right? So it's like you don't need to remember 20 different things. You remember, there's 5 dice or whatever, and they're actually different die types you can
Yeah.
physically see. So it's just kind of, it is, it's simpler in one sense, but more extensible in others, because I think it allows for people to more naturally kind of narrate for themselves. Like I've seen players kind of take on like, right, how do I think about my body or mind or whatever these abstractions? And we've done it very differently in the different games. So Stillfleet is the closest to, I think, like a D&D tactical, you have a score called combat. So the game already is pretty geared up to be kind of fighty in the way D&D is. But we did, even from the beginning, like I have, in there the class, the witness, who can just end combat by diplomacy, which is, a power that just works. And it doesn't mean that you can't get back in a fight like 2 seconds later if you punch a dude in the face, right? But it's sort of setting up that idea that, like you're saying about your bard, like what if we lean into that? Like the company wants to do trade, so they don't want to send people out there who can only fight, because what if sometimes they need to, like, keep the spice must flow, right? They need to squash the beef.
Yeah.
um and so how do you model that? Well, let's just make a power and see if that works. And what we found is it works hilariously well. People use it and kind of have strange anticlimaxes, which again just set up future fights. Or, it's not like, you can't have a power that's like world peace, right? But you can have a power that's like, hey guys, can we talk this out, right? And kind of, even it just leads to like a standoff or whatever it is, right? So I think just thinking through the logic of it a little differently. There are other games that do this well, I think, but I do think for futuristic, RPGs, Stillfleet does it exceptionally well, given that especially it was play tested for like 10 years. So it's like it's kind of the result of lots of people thinking about all of these archetypes and how to kind of
Mhm.
boil them down and make a game that really feels unique and weird, but doesn't require, you don't really need to know any lore to go in. You kind of just, you get the idea. You've watched Aliens, great, you could play this game, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I let's actually get into the thing that we're making together, because I think we can talk a little bit more of sort of the setting of Stillfleet by talking about Enter the Nostalgiatron, which is the project that you and I are working on together.
Indeed.
I would love to hear you describe it, because I know how I would describe it, and I've been doing that ad nauseum on podcasts, on our Thunderquack podcast. So our audience has heard me talk about it, but I would love to hear your sort of summation of this project that we've been working on.
Sure. Well, I think you'd approached me with an idea for a kind of 80s 90s themed version of Stillfleet, like a reskin where it's the same game, but it's kind of driven by the look of Saturday morning cartoons. Like, what if Stillfleet was a property, an IP of a giant company that sold toys in our childhood? And what would they make for their Saturday morning cartoon show that clearly is just about buying the toys, the play sets, and the action figures? And I think that's super fun. It's a different way to kind of satirize the things we're satirizing, right? So it's like a different level of satire. Instead of, you are yourself, you're presumably many people could play this from wherever, right? I'm in New York. I've lived in New York 20 years. I've worked desk jobs, white collar jobs. So it's kind of like you work for the bad guys, right? You are complicit in all the evil of empire. But it's the far future, and you're more of a space marine type, right? And so that's kind of what we're satirizing, is like a kind of labor relation. And in your version, it was like, no, let's satirize kind of almost like, what is this object? Like, this object is, a thing to get you to buy toys, which of course don't really exist. Although now we're going to make these cool acrylic minis. So in a weird way, there's like levels to this shit, right? We're like,
Yeah.
we're like making some toys in a sense, but not, articulated action figures. And I think that's just a cool visual regime. Like I grew up watching all that stuff. So it's, I think of it ambivalently, somewhat the way that I think about Alien and Blade Runner and all this stuff, which is, of course, there's flaws. And now as an adult, it's like I wouldn't watch He-Man for fun or Masters of the Universe or whatever. But, when I grew up, I watched, Transformers, um, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then, in the afternoons, Dragon Ball, that was our favorite. And those are things that really influenced, obviously, some of my ideas about, science fictionality, right? What the future will be like or should be like. They have very strange views on good and evil, but in some ways, those were like the obvious things. They're like, oh, that'll be really fun to satirize and kind of map onto Stillfleet. And then what I've found in creating it, so what it is at the end of the day, I think what we created is a 64-page comic book sized, beautifully illustrated and designed by you, right? Story, pretty much your creation as a story, and then you and I kind of wrote it together. And I kind of helped mechanicalize some of the things that you had ideas for, which were all really fun. Situation where a group of void miners are sent to a planet that is one of the canonical, worlds that the company trades with, the worshipful company whom you work for, and you're sent to find out whatever happened to some void miners who've gone missing, who were investigating a floating techno dungeon, a floating uh, spherical piece of a hulk from out of time and space that's very advanced, that just showed up over this sleepy medieval provincial town in this swampy island, in this poor part of this planet. And the company wants to know what's up with that for obvious reasons. It's sort of could be dangerous, it could be something they want to exploit, and that allowed us to create a sort of dungeon crawl. So we call them Hulk crawls in Stillfleet, meaning like dead spaceships, right? In the tradition of aliens, etc. And what we created was a place that is is controlled by. So it's very advanced. It's from the future. It's actually traveled back in time according to the whims of its new owner, who is related to the people in the future who will make it, who are the time traveling bad guys in Stillfleet called the Snake Men. So Ubun, the local tyrant, has, gotten control of this techno dungeon Hulk, brought it back to his time to just kind of rule over the island of which he is Baron, and he has empowered him from normal, scumbag kind of monster in a science fantasy setting to almost like infinitely powerful, right? So it's a really weird setting, I think, for a first level intro, but in another sense, it's very still Felician, right? Go into a weird modular techno dungeon. And the gag is that all of the areas in the techno dungeon, in the Nostalgitron, the titular place that is this floating, techno castle, all of them are kind of very clearly throwbacks to 80s, 90s cartoons. And you've done a great job kind of creating those and setting those up and thinking through the logic of like what kinds of, we even call them play sets, right? Like what kinds of encounters would be there. So it's meant to be a full adventure. You can play it start to finish, and you could play it multiple times because there's a lot of content and you don't need to explore all of it to kind of get to the end of the story. And it has a lot of the Stillfletian like what ifs, like even if you win without any spoilers or anything, it would still imply like, a lot of big questions about like, well, what is the right thing to do with this technology, with this situation, which is kind of the deeper level of the game. But it also has the full quick start rules, so it's a great way to just give someone one book that introduces them to the game itself with a very distinct look and feel and kind of unique characters, unique encounters. So it's to pitch it, it's just like a good overall intro that will be very reasonably priced and very beautifully made. But in terms of working on it, yeah, it was a lot of fun. And honestly, it just got darker and darker in my mind as we were actually writing, the sections we'd outlined, as frankly the elections in the US were happening. And I was just thinking about the kind of madman who like has basically ultimate power and uses it for reasons that are just so dumb. Like that was the big
Yeah.
joke, is that Ubun is Ubu Roy is Trump, right? Like he's just like a dummy who like doesn't have his vision is sort of the way that all, to me, comic booky cartoon show villains, their logic doesn't make any sense. It's not logical in the way that the neocons were like real bad guys whose logic I understood. I just disagree with inherently, right? Like I don't believe in the things that right wing politicians believe in. But then you get this neo far right types who just are like just crazy. I mean, Miele or whatever in Argentina. Look at Elon Musk. Like the things they do, it's kind of about making money, but it's also just kind of the guy in Argentina is talking to his dead dog to determine macroeconomic like decisions. So, I mean, this was the idea. Like, okay, so the Snake Man gets this really powerful spaceship and brings it into the atmosphere and just parks it above his town, and you have to go deal with it, right? That's your job. Figure it out. So what are the goofy things that could happen? And that to me was just a lot of fun to sort of see where your mind went with like what are the things you want to draw, right? And then how can I help you mechanicalize them and bring them into the sort of Stillfletian canon, you know what I mean? And it was a fun kind of brief in that sense of like, let's make a new quick start, let's make a new adventure that's like official but also completely different from anything we've done. So I do think it's fun. Hopefully it'll appeal to people who've played the game or heard of it and heard the kind of, I don't know, a little closer to that kind of like hard SF labor alien stuff, although extremely goofy, like the podcast Float City. But hopefully it'll also appeal to new players who just look at it and say, this is goofy. It looks like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in space. What the hell is this, right? So yeah, that's that's one way I would describe it. I don't know if that's given away too much and you want to like bleep a bunch of that out, Michael.
No, 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 no. It's awesome. I mean, I think talking not just the setting itself, or sort of the inspiration, the original inspiration point, but talking about like that deeper stuff, because there is more there for somebody who wants to read it cover to cover and really like look into sort of the satire and the finer notes of what we put together, because I do think that it is that there is an interesting component there of
Right, and you
the
could ignore that too. You could just run it
yeah,
as
oh
like,
totally,
I
yeah,
need a cool space dungeon. Cool. Here's like a one that's kind of goofy.
yeah,
It's got these 8 areas. It's got a bunch of bad guys. I don't, yeah, like you said, you don't have to read it cover to cover because it's a quick start plus a kind of
yeah,
dungeon crawl, right? That's what it is in a nutshell. But with Soulfleet, we try to make everything. Our whole model is more than play. So we try to make games that are super fun and replayable, but also have some sort of there, if that makes sense. So this was our kind of like making fun of a certain regime of like American media,
mhm,
childhood crap. I guess American and Japanese, right? Like Transformers, GI Joe, all
yeah,
that stuff.
yeah.
So I think it was great, and I think the art. I think you've really, really over delivered on the art. So I'm excited for people to sort of see that brought to life. Um,
Yeah,
so
it,
it's a
it's
podcast, but
I've said this on some other podcasts as well, but it's a funny thing to be approaching 40 and finally feel like I'm doing the thing that I should have been doing all along, right? Like this really to me feels like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, rad. Like, and so I think that is coming across in the quality of the art that I'm putting out, because it's just sort of it's like this closed loop of inspiration where it's like I'll draw something, I'm like, that's really cool, and then I'll show it to you, or I'll show it to a couple other people, to get feedback, and I'll get really good feedback on it, and it's like, oh, awesome, excellent. But at the same time, because I'm playing in your sandbox, I there's the right level of constraints around it for me, where it's like, okay, but remember that like you still have to sort of serve this larger thing, which is still fleet, which some artists don't like to work in that realm. They want to just kind of be left to their own devices. I personally really like being put inside of a box, so
right.
that I have clearly defined, okay, this is what I need to deliver, but then to also then get to play with like, okay, so where are the boundaries? Okay, that's a boundary. What if I push it just a little bit past that, right?
Yeah,
um
yeah, yeah.
and just be a little bit subversive in that way. And so yeah, still fleet being what it is, in its I said this on Forced Perspectives earlier this week when I was recording with Joe. It's like I refer to it as the vanilla version of Stillfleet, as opposed to our version, with the Nostalgiatron, which is that like 80s 90s sort of flavored one, but there's nothing vanilla about Stillfleet. Like that's what I really love about it, is that like the base game is so um it's so varied and it's so wild. I That you can open the book and you can look at the art and you get one sort of vibe or aesthetic of it being, this sort of like very gritty, grim dark sci-fi, as you said, like sort of that cosmic space, I sort of vibe to it. But then you start reading through some of the stuff and it's like, oh, some of these concepts are really absurd, like they're like
Yeah.
absurdist humor type stuff, like like a Rick and Morty type of like ridiculous future or space or whatever. But then you keep reading and you're like, oh, but there's actually something underneath that, like there was a reason why, right? And that sort of that flexibility of the boundary is something that makes it even more fun to play with, because it's like, because the boundary is there, like still fleet, I think, has a very clear sort of like attitude, and to me a very clear mission, but it also uh it leaves room for whatever ridiculousness you feel like you can cram into it, right?
Right,
Um,
yeah. That was kind of one of the ideas from the jump was, could we make could I make that was, again for my friends originally, a
yeah.
game where it was about the kinds of literary sci-fi that I like and the critiques I like, starting from really, Melville and Kafka on to, postmodern literature as such, and just like classic Office Space, right? Idiocracy,
Yeah.
and those kind of critiques of labor. And now I would say like um Justice Warriors, right? Like there's a whole, this sort of Chapo extended universe like world, Rory Blank's cartoons. I mean, there's so much stuff that I pay attention to that's sort of part of broadly the sort of new left critique of like techno corporate techno feudalism, frankly,
Mm.
the world in which we live, neoliberal, whatever shitbags. And like I wanted to make a game that was like about that in a sort of dark and funny way, but was also all that literary stuff I like, and was also just straight up, oh, you want to play Alien? Because a lot of friends, it's like for friends playing D&D, and I'm like, no, let's do D&D in space. Some of them, want to get into the weeds, and some, want to show up drunk and late on Friday and like be told who their character is and just play, so it's sort of like had to do all things for all people. But because it was just me and I had so long, I did so many campaigns over like a decade. I mean, and that's the thing with often, I think, I've now talked with other designers with like first games versus like now we'll start a game and get it done within a year, and it's very different, right? Because you're kind
Mhm.
of briefing, like you have like a team of people who are agreeing on like a concept and knocking it out. But with this, it was that organic, like, I don't know, maybe a little more of this, a little of that. So the game feels, I think, very heterogeneous, and I think approachable. Even though maybe, yeah, like the initial art, I love Ethan's art, and he's still the head artist. But we started, that was my brief room, was like, yeah, let's like make it look kind of grimdark, because I wanted it to sort of compete in a way, right, with people who
Mhm.
like Warhammer 40K or Mothership or UVG or whatever. um so, a little psychedelic, but pretty realistic in terms of like, okay, the realism of like it's a guy made out of nanites who's two guys whose minds are fused together. Yeah, how would that really look, right? Like we're
Mhm.
trying to represent it. We're not trying to do it impressionistically. We're trying to show you what that person would look like. That's a species in the book you can play called the Mournfolk, whose planet had like a civil war. It's as if basically everyone in Ireland and North Ireland merged into people who were one half of each. Which I'm
Mhm.
not suggesting I'm very pro. Like Ireland should just be all Ireland, but if they decided to do that, right, and we couldn't stop
Yeah.
them, and they used advanced technology, what would that look like? And that was one of those conversations with Ethan where it was very funny, where it's like, so you want me to draw realistically two people made of clouds of blue nanites that kind of look crystalline, but they also sort of look like people, but they kind of look like one person, but it's two people. And I was like, yes. So he's like, do they have two heads? I don't know. Is it one head with two faces? I mean, that was just one example of like, wait, are we making fun of something here? Or is this like really serious lore? Or like, at the end it becomes
Mhm.
one picture in the book, right? It's like one image with one playable species that was a one off idea in my head about like, okay, it's a game about politics. I'll go back to that Aristotle's list of types of ways to organize societies. And like, what if one of them is so technologically advanced that after a big civil war, they like reorganize their whole bodies, like not just their means of production, but like literally themselves around like mourning and guilt and like surviving and learning to be to meet everyone halfway, and kind of like if you did a centrism at the level of body horror, like what would that look like?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the kind of joke where like it can be played very straight, but no one has ever played it as such. Everyone who's played a Mournfolk is like, I have two characters, right? And they are fused together. And so they're kind of the same person. And they also kind of have to, they play it like, it's almost like really in a weird way. And this is not in any way meant to be ableist or anything, but it's like simulating conjoined twins, right? And so people play it as like, I think there is an element of like that would be weird and different, right, for those of us who are not conjoined twins, and don't have not had that experience. But also because you can defuse completely. That's one of your class power or your species powers, rather. You can just become two characters who just have half the stats, basically. That means you can have two very distinct, you can have goofy things happen where, character A that you're playing is doing something and character B is doing something else. Maybe they don't even want character A to know about. I don't know. So it opens up like a narrative can of worms that can be instantly very silly and goofy. Coming from an initial idea of like, I don't know, I need one more weird idea for an alien species that you could play. Let me come up with some sort of abstract, like one
Yeah.
line, like description, right? So the whole book is full of that. It was just like a bunch of one liners that seemed interesting, and then over 10 years developed specific rules and were played out in the goofiest possible way by my friends. And so that, what's in the book is a reflection of that process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if people want to know more about Stillfleet, I say the best way to do it is to jump into Float City. I think that
Oh, for sure.
podcast. I think the thing that works so well about that is that you have two GMs for Fun City and Float City, which you've got Mike and Taylor, and they will approach things from similar but also different avenues, and Still Fleet does that, right? You talk about the Mournfolk, and you could create a character like you said that's very straight, that's coming right out of the text description in the book, um and it would be like a very like sci-fi like like heady like, oh, interesting, like let's look at what if two diametrically opposed ideas had to inhabit the same body and work together, but or you can make that a He-Man villain, right? Like that is like it's like two-headed, when
Right,
they argue
right.
with each other, it's Michael Sheen and David Tennant doing the voices, and they're friends but they hate each other, right? Like it's you can go either way with that, and so much of Stillfleet is like that. Like you can do a Gelasti that's like the one in the book, that is this sort of like almost kind of grotesque, see-through skin giant salamander person, or you can do what we've done with it, which is like we've turned her into a ninja turtle, right? Like she's an action hero. She is the most like Ninja Turtle-esque of all of the characters that I've drawn, and that was on purpose, right? Like I
Yeah.
looked at it and it's like like our Gelasti Le Guin is very different looking from what the Gelasti in the book look like.
Well, and that
um
and that that comes down to just like playing characters in these games, which you can do with D
yeah,
and D. Like you can take the idea of a bard, and good AP does this in general. And so, Fun City and the associated shows, do this in general, right? Like I'm thinking of Rude Tales, but even like Worlds Beyond Number, like you have people who take basic quote unquote vanilla ideas and then kind of invert them,
yeah.
mess with them. Dimension 20, right? You have like I'm a talking rat in New York, but I'm using D&D rules. So like for example, my friend Will Savino, shout out to him. He's Music D20. He makes music for RPGs and also Burrowbound. So he writes kind of speculative cities for RPGs. He played in a long time Stillfleet campaign as a Gelasti who was a peer, a doctor, and his whole take on it was, I'm going to be a simple, I may be a simple country doctor, but and he played it, he hammed it up, and it was fucking hilarious. It was such a good use of like you're a single celled salamander shaped alien, like a 4.5 foot tall, jiggly, like, I would say they look like if gummy bears were real and like sort of the
Hmm.
size of teens. And you've signed up for the company, been trained as a doctor, and you're sent off on missions. But like he played it as like a country lawyer type character and was
Yeah,
kind of the face, like he was the one that, everyone's talking to for the group, that kind of like leader role. And it was so funny. It was just so funny because they would have these high level, dangerous, violent encounters. They'd be talking to sort of like evil late Tefnian war machines. So, sort of like Megatron, right? Is like there's like a 50-foot tall robot monster that can reconfigure itself made of nanites screaming at them. And he's like, well, I may be a 4.5 foot tall, jiggly, single-celled organism. What do I know? But the way I see it is, and it was such a good like use of like I arbitrarily chose this based on an image when I flipped through the book, but now I'm gonna like that's
hmm, yeah,
that's where I'm going with it. So I love the idea of like, yeah, or maybe there's one who's like, she's a Ninja Turtle. She's really badass. She's like, playing against type. And that is the power of these games in general, right? Is you can find something on one page just by flipping through that appeals to you and be like,
yeah,
I'm going to do this, but a Viking who always is eating like a string of hot dogs in a sort of old school cartoonish way, right? Whatever it is. And
yeah.
make the game your own, like
Yeah,
anything.
I mean, this is funny because that reminds me of a thing that happened, it's like a week or two ago, where I was flipping through the book, and I'm flipping through it, looking at the graphic design and layout and stuff like that to compare it to what I'm doing, try and find a solution for a problem that I'm having with the layout of our book, and I come across the dolphinoids, and I was like, we are so far into our project already. It is way too late for me to introduce, but it's like there are so many ideas that instantly hit my brain of like there are like 10 characters that I want to create with this species that I didn't know was in here, because it's on one page and there's one illustration, and
Right.
like you can flip past it and totally miss it, and then I saw it and was like, oh man, so it's like, okay, we earmark that future project. We're definitely coming
Right.
back to it. But yeah, it that like Stillfleet is just so it's so huge. But then I like Float City, I think again is the best example, and people should go listen to it because you'll hear how the game is actually played, and you'll get all of that component of it. But what you'll get more than that is you'll see how varied the ideas in the world are, but how simple they actually break down, because it all ends up being very relatable, right? It's either like, it's sort of, it's just the thing that everybody is about at the end of the day, which is like everybody's just trying to figure it out and make their way in this universe. And sometimes that's commerce and sometimes that's combat, and I it just it can go off the rails so fast, but it can also just be like so mundane in a really like interesting and fascinating way. Because when it's I love it when things are weird and totally relatable and understandable, right?
Right.
like
Right.
like you have a 4 foot tall salamander hanging out with this sad beast man thing, and they're a team, and they're really just trying to broker a deal to make a trade route. It's like it's just it's the stuff that I really love in Star Wars that I feel like doesn't really get enough play in Star Wars. It's the stuff that's happening in the background that makes that world to me so inhabitable and so much fun. And I love when the shows and the movies go off on those little tangents, and then I see online everybody reacting of like, can we just get back to lightsabers and starships and stuff? And it's like, that stuff is like so uninteresting to me, because it's like that's the window dressing that everybody has, because anything can have a laser sword. It's not that big of a deal. We have a laser sword in ours.
Yeah.
But it's like it's that other stuff that can be so interesting to me.
Well,
But
and I think you're getting to, something. So when I teach game design now, I like focus on this as like narrative structure versus setting. Like having an interesting setting is great and should sort of be a sine qua non. Like don't publish something that if it has a setting, right, it's not a
mm,
universal game, and I'm much more likely to engage with it if it's not universal, but if it has some sort of specificity, make it interesting, obviously. But there's lots of ways to do that, and you're never going to reinvent. Like there's sort of lots of genres and subgenres that have already been explored. But the narrative structure can be really truly unique. So like Stillfleet has the narrative structure of you're given a job by your boss and told to go and do it, and you're expected to do it, and then you come back and have to report on what you did, and they're not there with you, so you can lie. And it's really the same as a lot of these sort of jobs where you're quote unquote an expert or whatever, and you have a degree of freedom. But over time, right, the company wants different things than you, lies can add up, and it's meant to be a campaign where you can play it as a sort of a series of one-offs, but over time, your decisions matter. And I would actually compare it closest to like Severance, right? It's coming out of the tradition of like Kafka or whatever, but then marrying that with D&D. So you go off and do dungeon crawls in space, but then you come back and lie to your boss about it, or they've lied to you, and that does or doesn't matter. And your decision about like how you relate to your job, how you relate to the company changes over time. And so it's almost like not really being Ripley per se, but kind of playing out the Alien and Blade Runner movies as such, just like the
mhm.
world of those movies. And that was, those are like, that's one reason we're talking about Alien is that's like such a big influence on me. And that type of fiction. So that's one way to think about it. And I think what you're getting at with Star Wars is like it has, I think the dominant narrative structure is this kind of space opera, Joseph Campbell myth stuff that is kind of unearned. Like the first few movies, okay, we all like those. But after that, it feels kind of unearned. It's like, I don't care about these politics. I'm not sold on them. But to your point, it has such a rich world with many, many other things. And you see it with like The Mandalorian of a different structure that feels to me more interesting, right? It's a better
Mhm.
payoff because it's tied. It's like there's a real society and there's a dude in that society. And we're learning about, all the weird, interesting stuff that goes on, and the structure of the jobs and all that is kind of fits better with that interesting world. Whereas in the later movies, especially, which are all kind of remakes of remakes, it's like I don't understand what like why we're on this journey. I don't care. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to
Yeah,
kind of get into it.
yeah.
So I think to some degree it's about what is the structure you want players to go on, like from a game standpoint. What do you want them to do? And then the setting should be sort of obedient to that, if that makes sense, or like they should naturally go together. There should be what's called thematic integration. So the setting and the structure and the types of characters, they all make sense together so that someone can easily approach it and be like, aha, I get what I'm doing. I'm like doing a Severance like bad, I hate my job, malingering, but I'm a space marine, and I'm an alien working for a company in space, right? And so it's sort of what's the Star Trek show, Fourth Deck or whatever, Below Deck. But it's
Oh yeah,
also
lower
like
lower
Lower
decks.
Deck,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But it's also sort of alien, and you can kind of like
yeah.
quickly jet dive in. So what we've done with Nostalgitron also is just like take that and just draw it very, very differently and write it differently, right? Because it's
Mhm.
your take, which is super fun. So I don't know, that could be a segue toward anything. That's just to kind of you know try to put a little of a cap on like what Stillfleet is and
Yeah,
how it
yeah.
relates to these other genres of SF.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's get into Alien, but before we do, I just want to tell everybody go to stillfleet.com/enter. I've been telling everybody to do this for the last month or so. So I'm sure they're all tired of hearing me say it, but for real, please do it. Go to stillfleet.com/enter, and that's going to take you to our backer kit campaign, which when this episode goes out to Patreon supporters, it's going to be uh, imminent. But if you're hearing this on the regular podcast feed, I think it's already happening. So yeah, you can get in and back us and pick up the book, and it's everything that you need in order to get started. It's just in the 64 pages. You just off to the races. All you need is some dice. And nowadays you don't even need to go get dice because you can just use digital tabletops and stuff as well. But yeah, I'm so excited for people to get this thing and check it out, and that's still going to be a little ways off even from the beginning of the campaign, but just to be out there and talking about it even more, and 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 putting this out into the world, it's awesome because I spend a lot of time talking about media, and this will be really the first thing that I've put out that's that's a real thing that people can purchase and participate in, and I'm not just doing fan art of something else, some property that I don't have the right to do fan art of, and all of that sort of thing. This is a real thing that I've made with you, and it's been awesome. It's been the best, and it's all I ever want to do from here on out is create worlds and characters and all of that, and put it out into the world for people to enjoy and participate in, and come back to me and talk about, and just keep that conversation going. It's a funny thing because the whole Star Wars of it, everybody who listens to the podcast knows that I am a dyed in the wool, tried and true Star Wars fan, but I'm so frustrated with that franchise at the moment. And I've said for years to the people who were complaining about Star Wars, and they're complaining for dumb reasons. It's too woke and blah blah blah, whatever. This isn't how I remember it when I was 10 years old, because you're not 10 years old anymore. But what I would often say to a lot of people is like, if Star Wars isn't doing for you what you need it to do, there's actually a really simple solution to that, and it's to go out and just like make your own thing. Just go do your own thing, because if it's not fulfilling that, you actually can just go make that thing, because that's what Star Wars was in the beginning. Like, that's what George Lucas was doing. He wanted to make Flash Gordon, they wouldn't let him, so he just went and he made his own Flash Gordon, and he just took all of the things that he loved and he just mashed them all together. That's what we did with Nostalgitron. Is like, I literally just took a bunch of these things that inform who I am and that I love, and kept throwing them at you, and you kept going like, yeah, okay, here's how we can fit that in, and here's how we can fit that in. And the result, I think, is something that is, when you look at it, you'll see it and you'll go, obviously it's inspired by these things. You look at Ubun the Ripper, and he is very clearly inspired by some specifics, supervillains of the Saturday morning cartoon genre, but he's also his own thing. Like, we've also created a character who is his own character, and it's, I don't know, it's really really cool to see it come together. So I hope that everybody just goes and checks it out and supports it. Again, stillfleet.com/enter, and yeah, I'm not gonna stop talking about it just because the campaign is about to happen, but it was really cool for us to actually like have this in-depth conversation about it, and that'll continue in other places as well,
For
because
sure.
because Wythe, you also have a podcast. Do you want to just really quickly here at this point just tell people about your show?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Why We Roll is the Stillfleet Studios podcast on TTRPG design. So sounds specific, but it's really, it's meant to be sort of like car talk, which I don't know if, if that dates me or whatever, but like, when podcasts were first a thing, like I remember listening to car talk and I hate driving. I actually don't think cars should sort of exist in the way that they do. But it's a really great podcast. It's a really good like show where you're getting into technical weeds and having
Mhm.
fun with experts. And so what we do, my friend Christopher Pickett, who's the designer of Danse Macabre, which is our third grid system game that's coming out later this year, which is sort of medieval horror, sort of like a zombie apocalypse happens in the 1300s. And so you're in Constantinople, and it's using the same system but totally different than Stillfleet in that sense. You're a pilgrim looking for quintessence, for artifacts that can sort of change back the world. And Chris and I interview game designers who are professionals somehow related to the industry. So a lot of these folks are, they've made like a really, really cool, basically zine. Most of them are sort of indie designers who work professionally. And then some people are like musicians or, more into the art design side, or somehow, AP like podcast streamers.
Mm.
And so we have great conversations just generally about basically the world of indie tabletop role playing games. So if you're at all interested in that subject, obviously we do touch on D&D and Pathfinder, and we touch on other games a lot. So we'll talk about kind of the differences between designing what are called finite and infinite games, story games versus games you can win, like board games. Yeah, and it's a lot of fun. We have a bunch of episodes with all different folks. We're focused also on politics and history, of course, like everything the studio does. So we always ask people sort of spicier questions about politics, but I would say that's pretty minimal. I mean, that's probably like 10% of the conversation. Most of it is that sort of car talk, like, why did you
Mhm.
choose those things about your game? Which, actually, Michael, it's similar to what you're asking about the grid system. So I appreciate
Yeah.
the way you worded those questions because that's kind of how we think about it. Is like these design choices are intentional. They have some thought behind them. So let's get into it. So we've done so many good ones. Just thinking backward, we just interviewed Kayla Dice about Transgender Deathmatch Legend 2, which is a wrestling RPG using cards. It's really great. It's like a really great game that like I would never have made this game in a million years. It's super fun. I've played it. Um, so it's just a great show where we like encounter designers we think are cool and doing just different stuff.
Mhm.
And yeah, Michael, we look forward to having you on, and that will be the one where we go super in depth on, I guess, probably some of the more mechanical, like how do you create encounters that feel like 80s, 90s
Yeah.
cartoons, right?
Totally, totally. Yeah, I really, so I'll tease everybody. Uh, my inclination was to start talking about our heroes, and I pulled back a little bit because I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna save that. I want to get into why
Right,
we picked
right.
the characters that we did, the archetypes, and all of that aspect of it. So that's my tease for when I'm gonna be on why we roll. When people are listening to this episode, I think it's coming soon, very soon. So yeah, awesome. Let's just hard transition. I love
Let's
it
do it.
when a segue is just when people are like, oh, great segue, it's like, well, now it's not because you called out that it was a great segue, which just defeats the purpose of it. But I love a hard right into the topic, which our listeners know. So let's get into Alien Romulus. I'm again give you guys the primer. So here we go. The seventh film in the mainline Alien franchise, Romulus serves as sequel to both recent prequel films Prometheus and Covenant, as well as to the original film 1979's Alien. Following the events of the Nostromo and Ellen Ripley's first encounter with the perfect organism, the xenomorph, Wayland Yutani has recovered the creature with the intent to research its properties and fulfill Peter Wayland's dream of achieving human immortality. Of course, this proves to be the latest in a series of miscalculations on the part of the Weyland Yutani Corporation, and chaos ensues, leaving the research station Renaissance adrift. Thankfully, a crew of industrious young colonizers arrives to wake it up, along with its deadly inhabitants, to deadly effect. Romulus returns the Alien franchise to its roots in horror and suspense, eschewing the larger scope and diluted grandeur of its recent predecessors. A focus on practical effects, nostalgic production design, and gritty cinematography brings this series back to the 80s where it belongs. So load up your pulse rifle and protect your mouth hole because we're digging in to Alien Romulus. I
Such a great intro. Really good.
I listen, I went on a roller coaster ride this last few days because I hadn't watched Covenant or Prometheus, because Prometheus was so poorly reviewed. Uh, and now, having watched those two movies and then capping it off with Romulus, which everybody was telling me was such a great movie, um, it there's a lot of ups and downs. I love the Alien franchise. I love both it by itself as well as, when you mix it with the peanut butter and chocolate of the Predator franchise, Colonial Marines, all of the like larger comic book stuff I love as well. But I also like to keep them all kind of separate but together at the same time. Um, but I had kind of not checked those ones out because people were like, they're not great. And so I was like, I don't, well, then I don't need to, right? It's like I've never watched The Predator all the way through because I watched the first 20 minutes of it and was like, this is not great. And just kind of
Really
walked away from
interesting.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Predator is one of the more recent ones, not the original
Oh,
Predator. I
not the
love the
original. Got it.
original
Got it.
Predator. Yeah.
Sorry, I
That's
don't think I've seen the
no,
Predator either. Then I
naming
didn't know that
conventions in the
happened.
Predator franchise are so obnoxious because there's Predator, which is the original, the Predator, which was the one that takes place like sort of in Alaska, I think. I and then there's Predators, which is the one where instead of the Predator coming here, they abduct a bunch of people and take them to their planet. So like, but those are all, it's Predator, the Predator, and Predators, and it's like, come on, guys, like let's figure this out. But those other ones like Prometheus and Covenant, I had heard were just kind of like they were too grandiose, right? Like they just kind of got a little bit lost in their own sauce, and so I watched them and I was like, agreed. But actually, they're not that bad. I think like as films, they're really not that bad. There are a lot worse movies.
Oh yeah.
But it is definitely Ridley Scott going like, hey, that thing that you guys all love, let me tell you everything about it. And it's like, hey, were you not paying attention in 1999 when George Lucas invented midichlorians and told us how the Force works, and we all hated that? And so that was kind of my thing coming off of Prometheus and Covenant, where it was like, this is too much of the explanation of where these things come from. This is
Oh
too much
really?
origin story. This is too much of like you're taking away the mystery and the fun of it. Um, so
Oh, see, I didn't think it achieved that. I don't think it really explained anything. I
oh
think
no, okay.
Prometheus just didn't make any sense. I
I
like
mean,
I
there is also that.
I'm a strict materialist. I think you have to have some level of hard SF. Like, how could this ever work? Like the midichlorians,
Yeah,
like that stuff to me is the feature, not the flaw. But I don't think it. I don't think Prometheus explained a thing. I think it just was like, it's this infinite regressus of like you finally find the planet that explains everything, but then it's actually not the planet that explains everything. It's just kind of like an armory. I don't.
yeah,
It's sort of like didn't really clarify. Like you wake up, God, and you're like, tell me the secrets, and he's just like, I'm a monster, and I'm gonna
yeah,
kill you. And you don't, on the one hand, it's meant to be this profound, like we could never understand true alterity, but on the other hand, it's just sort of a meaningless. Like I don't think it hits on any particular way, in sort of the classic tropes of like Frankenstein's duty to his creature,
yeah,
or Jekyll and Hyde, or any of these questions, right? Newer works about AI, like books by Richard Powers or something about like what if there you created something that had sapience. So again, kind of versions of Frankenstein's creature, but I don't think Prometheus like gets close enough to any sort of meaningful explanation. It just like hints at a lot of things. To your point, like hints at lore.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
guess the lore, to your point, that it explains is around like the dude himself. Like, so you're super rich future Elon Musk guy who wants to live forever, and yeah, it doesn't work out. So that's a nice moment of like catharsis for the viewer, where you're like, well, I'm glad that guy died, but yeah, it doesn't. It's not. It doesn't really hit. I think it's not a bad. At the time I hated it, but since then there have been so many bad remakes, and just everything in science fiction. There have been good ones too, like
yeah,
Blade Runner and Dune,
yeah,
but for the
yeah,
most part, it feels like all IP will be kept in this zombie mode due to like capital. It's like one of the few things the global north can do is like make action movies, so they're just going to keep remaking action versions of things from our childhood forever.
yeah,
So given
yeah,
that, I actually appreciate, to your point, that Prometheus and Covenant, while flawed, were like an auteur's attempt to do something new with his own toys, um,
Yes.
and like whatever, that's he had the ability to marshal that money and make the movies. So yeah, I have a softer view of them now. At the time, I thought
Totally.
Prometheus was like, oh, what a letdown. I really wanted it to be like super deep and amazing. Um, but yeah, no, I'm really glad to be talking about Romulus and kind of all of them together because I do think to your point, it's compared to Predator, which is I like Predator fine, but they are kind of dumb action movies, whereas
Yeah.
Alien is a tighter world that even despite Prometheus and Covenant maybe missing the mark, it still feels like a cohesive world. All of those movies go together in a certain way. And they
Yes.
get at something different. The same way with werewolves are about the idea that all of us have within us this violence, right? That's the predator, right? It's the werewolf thing of like we live in a cruel world. The sort of misreading of Darwin, whereas Alien is more like the vampire, right? This sort of the frankly the danger of rape, right? The idea of like others doing things to your body,
Yeah.
and what is your relation to alterity. So it's like relation to self, relation to alterity, and I think that both myths in their science horror modern form are can be really elegant and well told, and I think especially for some reason that the sort of vampire slash alien myth is just like really enduring, like Nosferatu. I mean, we went and saw that great movie, and it just felt like this again will never die. Like we're never going to stop having vampire movies. I also don't think at this point we're ever going to stop having xenomorph movies, even if we
Mhm.
had to change the name for legal reasons, or whatever, right? So let's get into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, let's rewind for a second because I want to before we get deep into Romulus because there's so much to talk about with this.
Totally.
I just want to get like the sort of origin for you with the Alien franchise because I always find this really interesting when people pick a perfect 10, where that came from, right? What because it usually tends to have pretty deep roots. So for you, like when did you first encounter the Alien franchise?
So I saw in late middle school Alien, the original, on that we watched with a DVD that had some sort of flaw where it was in black and white. So it was hard black and white. So a lot of the movie was just black and you could just hear the sounds. And I watched it, I think, late afternoon, probably on a Saturday or Sunday at my friend Patrick's house in Atlanta. So his parents were like very Christian, but they kind of let us watch like whatever, in the same way my parents were hippies and like let us watch whatever. And I grew up watching like R-rated stuff from the jump. This was, I think,
Mhm.
shocking to his parents that we were like watching this movie, but they didn't like stop us. So we watched a bizarre, flawed version in black and white that was terrifying. Like even watching it like 4 p.m., it was like the scariest thing. It was so cool. And I think I just never seen a movie like that. And I love art movies, and I definitely in high school, especially my friend Patrick and I got really into a lot of artsy movies. But I think Alien to me was actually one of those original encounters with like different ways of doing cinematography and storytelling that aren't
Mhm.
Hollywood driven. And some of it might have been literally that we had like his friend's copy from his church or whatever, like it had a scratch or something where it just like didn't read color. And I think it's funny, those things like you have no control over, right? Those contingencies, like you're saying, of just like how do you first encounter the Ridley Scott extended universe, which now I feel like has been, like I said, it's probably when you ask me about Perfect 10, it's like the number one inspiration on Still Fleet is probably Alien and Blade Runner. So I saw it and it just felt very profound in the way that when I first encountered, I think a lot of what I now think of as the science fiction canon, the modern like let's say like feminist science fiction canon on, like 70s stuff on feels
Mhm.
it's starting with Dune, I guess, going back to Dune and kind of onward when you first read Le Guin or even the science fantasy stuff, Michael Moorcock. There's just certain stories, certainly for me, Le Guin, Octavia Butler, M. John Harrison's Viraconium, and then a lot of when I first read Lovecraft, it was the same thing. It was the eerie, chilling, the thick description, the science, the complete feeling that it's grounded in a material reality that is true. It's not magical. It's like there are aliens. Oh, and they're bad. Like you do not want ever to meet the aliens. That
Yeah.
that felt so profoundly brought to life in this movie in like a arc that was also tied. I think what makes it great is like Lovecraft can bring it to life, but it's the arc of a guy you wouldn't actually like and doing something boring like being a geologist in Antarctica and then running away. Whereas with, you know, like Ellen Ripley's like a character you really like. And so in the movies, you're kind of encountering pure alterity and real terror and real fear of losing control of your body, but with someone who you're rooting for and whom you see yourself in as a hero, as a really badass action hero. And I think Alien especially the first three. I like all the first three, and I think they all really nailed that vibe of like
Hmm.
you're rooting for someone in their very different movies, but especially the original, but all three I think kind of go together in a sense in a trilogy that just feels like okay, we're exploring a certain version of pure alterity is just terrifying. And it kind of creates all those questions around what does it mean to be human, what is intelligence, is this thing intelligent or not? And I think I remember having those discussions even as a kid and being like, okay, that's pretty deep, right, for what we thought of as like an action movie or horror movie, right? It felt deeper than when I watched frankly like The Shining or something, which I don't think is that great of a movie. Like, it's okay. It's kind of silly. The Alien like got me in a way that just it felt more real. It felt more like this could be like probably I will never live that life, right? But this could be a thing that humans have to sort of face. And as you go through the series, it brings up all these questions again of like, oh, these are like weapons, right? These are created. So as I've gotten older, just to sort of really quickly jump forward, it's like as I've seen more of them and rewatched them, it's brought up more present questions around bioethics, the ethics of using technologies that manipulate life as a tool, but also just more broadly like questions about science and discovery and really the techno-corporate element, and that struck true even when I was relatively right, like middle class kid, not like working hard as a whatever 13-year-old, but it brought up those questions of like, oh right, this is like a company paying her to do this and this is not like safe and they haven't they haven't thought this through. To your point,
Yeah.
there's a real great thread through all the movies of like the Whale and Utani Company being like the Washington Generals of space capitalism. Like they just cannot stop losing, and I kind of love it. And I think that's
Yeah.
again something I fell in love with before I could say why. As a young Marxist, right? Like I was just beginning to think about this stuff, and this movie brought it to life. And only later now I can be like, okay, that makes sense. Totally why I love the movie so much. But as a kid, I was just like thunderstruck by really the look and feel and the story, and yeah, um, I don't know. It's just like never left my memory. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It so I my original sort of encounters with it were around the time of Aliens, right? And so it was action figures and stuff like that of Ellen Ripley with a flamethrower, or the power loader and whatever, and Space Marines and stuff. And it wasn't until I was much older that I when I was in film school that I watched the original film, and I had never really dug Aliens that much, like that movie. I was always like, yeah, cool, yeah, the xenomorph is rad. When I was younger, I was much more of a Predator type of person, and it's funny because you use the analogy of werewolf versus vampire, and I think that when you put those two templates over this, it makes perfect sense for me. And then it also is a thing of like, I think you can ask people, like, are you a werewolf or a vampire type of person? And I personally am more of the werewolf side of things. Like I
Right,
like I
right,
lean more towards that sort of thing. I but when I then watched the original film, I was like, okay, I get it. And I just like, sort of understood a lot better where things were coming from, and what was going on. I was again also older, much older, and so ready to understand more of the nuance of it. Because when you're a kid and you watch Aliens, on TV, like the TV edit in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's not the same movie. That's not the same movie when nobody's swearing and nothing is graphically happening on screen and we're cutting away from things. And it's just, it's a thing that I think that the younger generations after us are really missing out on, is the TV edit, where it's like, listen, everything depends on perspective. And when somebody comes in and they censor or edit the intent of the artist, it completely alters the art. Right. And so there's a lot of movies like that I watched as a kid and was like on TV, and then encountered later as an adult and was like, oh, this is actually awesome. Like, this is actually really, really good. That version that I saw was watered down. The punches were pulled. And as a kid, you're not picking up that the xenomorph is not the bad guy in Aliens, right? Paul Reiser is the bad guy in
right,
Aliens. He's
right.
the villain. And you have none of the understanding of Lance Henriksen's character in that one, because you didn't watch the first one, and so you're not comparing it to Ash. You're just like, why is she so mad
Right.
at this guy? He's just a robot. Leave him alone. but yeah, then going back, getting more context, the AVP franchise happening, and me being like, okay, in order to enjoy this, I have to understand all of this other stuff, and me being like a shared universe junkie, and Blade Runner being one of my favorite universes. It's like, okay, so Blade Runner, Alien, Predator. Technically, I think it's Soldier, right? Yeah, it's one of those ones that's like, because it like mentions one of the corporations in it, and so people are like, that's part of the universe too. And then I also say Total Recall is
Oh yeah.
because of the Blade Runner connection, that they're all a shared universe, right? And it's confusing for a lot of people because they take place in different time periods. But at the end of the day, they are all part of one thing, and the thing that connects all of them except for the Predator franchise is this idea of that corporate overlord, and the inescapable sort of future of capitalism just being really the driving motivator to humanity.
Yeah.
Imperialism, colonialism, all of that stuff.
Well, it's
uh,
the it's kind of the what if, what makes the whole extended universe so good, and how it relates to my practice in terms of our sci-fi RPGs is that it takes the very seriously the challenge of no one being able to imagine a future that isn't capitalism, right? So the
yeah.
most famous like version of that is Frederick Jameson, the famous postmodern Marxist, literary critic, had written a, some sense, I'm paraphrasing, but it's, no one can imagine an end to capitalism because it has this xenomorphic ability, right? The metaphor is, it's kind of like the xenomorph is capital. Anything that it touches, it
Hmm.
can kind of become and use the worst elements of to sort of keep rapaciously eating and moving forward and eating and moving without any real thought or personality. It just sort of it's intelligent and quite smart in a lot of ways, but it exists to sort of kill, metabolize, exploit, move forward. So it sort of is colonialism, it is imperialism. And I
Yeah.
think, those movies all take seriously this premise that, like, well, what if that just continues? What if it never stops? So, there's various times and places, and you see it, as you say, in these different versions. So, Total Recall is a novella by Philip K. Dick that's brought to life as this hokey action movie in the 80s that I grew up with and
Hmm.
loved, right? And it was like mind blowing to watch, Schwarzenegger on Mars and terraforming. But it's also like, it is kind of beginning to get at this idea of like slowly humans going out, right? In Blade Runner, people are moving out to the belt, and it's kind of this expanse era tech. And then with Alien, you're much further in the future, but basically nothing has changed. The way that people operate, and Romulus, to jump ahead to that, starts
Yeah.
from jump, right from the very beginning. The cowcatcher or whatever is the same. Like, we are in a world where you have a job that the techno feudal masters want you to do, and it's not a great job. And there's a kind of dole because there has to be, because that's how, with the falling rate of profit, and just like that's how labor will work in the future or something. There's going to be some sort of UBI to keep workers alive, but then they're going to be, they're going to have limited rights. And if that doesn't change, it's like, okay, well, that'll just happen, but on insert name of new planet here, and you can just
Yeah.
kind of keep doing it. So it's a kind of gag that feels timely and continues to feel timely. Although my hope is one day we look back and this is an artifact. This is a kind of nightmare shadow of like the moment we're living in politically, and that 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s fears will not be the fears of our grandkids, right? That they will
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
say, well, I'm glad we changed that, or that stopped being the thing to worry about,
Yeah.
um, but I definitely think, yeah, there's an element of kind of timelessness to all of them, even though, as you point out, the actual movies take place at different points in time.
Hmm.
Which is also, like, I will say again, a fun, like, part of me is hard for them from that sort of art movie perspective of like, they're allowed to be a lot weirder than other mainstream IP in the kind of Marvel version of sci-fi,
Yeah.
where yes, there's confusing plot jumps, but it's sort of everything has to be over explained. You're trying to hit the middle of the bell curve for like global audience. So you can't, even when you're weird, you have to spend a lot of time explaining the weird. And they did okay, I think, with, right, the Avengers cycle. But here, the movies are allowed to be very different and jump around. There's different directors. They're not all equally good necessarily, but they're all kind of trying to do something interesting with this same design brief of like, cool, techno feudalism in space. There's aliens, which are basically like missiles, right? They're like technologies. So they are both bad guys, or they're things you don't want around, but they're also not the ultimate bad guy. The ultimate bad guy is this power structure.
Hmm.
And so how do you then tell stories in that? And Romulus, of course, it maybe not perfect, but it's like a different take. It's a different version from like an AVP, right? So it has action, it has horror, but it's getting back to that original We're seeing it through a particular, to your point about perspective, we're seeing it through a real human perspective of like a human's job, which sucks, and what would she choose to do, right? And so that's how she's intersecting with, dangerous androids, the evil company, and of course the xenomorphs, right? Um, so yeah, I think if someone has not seen, it's interesting to think about your audience. If someone has not seen any of the Alien movies, this might all sound really insane, but
Yeah, yeah. I think the xenomorph is a thing that has made it into, the pop culture lexicon. It's that, I mean, people will just call it the alien, but the alien from Aliens. But everybody
right,
knows what
right,
it is. They know the gags. They know the mouth coming out of the mouth. But yeah, the finer points of it, and I think that that's one of the things that sometimes gets lost when something hits that level of ubiquity, where it's like, and now everybody knows what this is. There's a Simpsons or Family Guy joke about it, and then a lot of people take that joke and they go, oh, so that's what that thing is, and then they don't actually like investigate what it is. And so I think you have an attitude towards the Alien franchise that it is popcorn fare. When I look at actually like all seven of the films in the mainline franchise and go like, actually every single one of these is fairly like heady sci-fi. I but
totally,
there are certain ones that are definitely more on the popcorn side of things, like Resurrection, and I would say even Romulus is a little bit more on the popcorn side of things. but
yeah,
but
yeah,
but ultimately they all have really really interesting things to say under the surface of it,
yeah,
and that to me is such a perfect zone to be in, because I want my art to hit as many people as possible, but then to challenge them, right? Like you want people to engage, um but you also want them to have something to engage with once you've got them, right? like
right,
like
right,
it's
right.
it has to have something underneath it.
And I
But
think there's different ways and that people approach that, right? And I think even Resurrection,
mm,
and it's, to me that's more like in the subgenre of the kind of Philip K. Dick, the psychedelic, right? It feels more like Total Recall
mhm,
because it's goofy in a
yeah.
weird way, but in some ways it's very deep. It actually reminds me a lot of like Dead Ringers, right? Especially the reboot. The show was fantastic. One of the best sci-fi shows out there is the reboot show, where they're taking Cronenberg's Dead Ringers, and Rachel Weisz is doing this command performance as these twin gynecologists, and it's a body horror show about motherhood and like, yeah, really deep questions about bodies and mothers, and remind me of Alien right away. It's a big
Mm,
theme that I think goes through all the Alien movies, especially Resurrection. But it's also Cronenbergian. It's goofy, it's silly, it's like not, it's like Rachel Weisz like being snarky and sneering and funny, and it's not like a serious show at the same time that it's extremely serious about like the
yeah.
sensitive trigger warning subjects, but it's like treated in this almost hammy way that I don't know. I mean, again, it feels of that sort of almost 70s like Philip K. Dick inspired moment. And I think these things also come in waves and come back and forth, and like I don't know. There's some, I always remember, I can't remember now who said this, but like puns are only funny in certain moments in culture. And as cultures
Mm,
decline, they become considered funnier and funnier. And there's a kind of unweaving and unknitting apart of culture, and people hang on to like kind of dumb jokes, and like
yeah.
and I think there's something with like these cycles of like when body horror feels meaningful, and there was a moment probably 15 years ago now when biopunk was really a big thing, and like that's another theme we can talk about, but like that was, I think, in response to real advances in technology that people were grappling with genetic engineering, but then they became metabolized quickly into the normal pharmaceutical development process that takes decades. So it just was like, oh, none of this is like, I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and people are going to have in some new fad like attached arms to their bodies, or like
Yeah.
switched their gender by taking a pill or something. Like none of that is possible, so whatever, it doesn't really matter. Now I think it's kind of body horror is coming back in part because of maybe other concerns about bodies that aren't tied to pharmaceuticals per se. Although there's like GLP-1, there are like a huge advances all the time that might be on people's minds. But I think they just come and go in waves, and I think it's interesting how Alien has been with us. Like you said, I mean, I saw the stuff in the mid '90s. I'm 40, so
Mhm,
I didn't see a 1979 movie when it came out. Like I don't know. Like for me, this all starts in the '90s.
yeah.
And is actually, it's funny, it's I wasn't thinking of this, but it is the same era I'm watching He-Man and Dragon Ball Z. So for
Yeah.
me, the
Yeah.
Alien movies, He-Man, Dragon Ball Z, they were all like equally, I just treated them as like objects in my life that were sort of weirdly important. They were kind of like our, suburban like religion, right? That was like we didn't like go to church, like we like watched a lot of TV and movies. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
we
No.
can we can get into it,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah. Well, this stuff is the stuff of Greek myth and legend, right? Like that.
Oh
I think
yeah,
for our generation, um, Saturday morning cartoons and 80s culture, like the pop culture of that era, that is really the purpose that they served. It's the purpose that the MCU serves in the 2000s, right? Like these characters take prominence and these stories take prominence because we need stories. We need them
right.
in order to digest the things that are happening in our world. And I think one of the reasons why things like Alien are coming back in the cycle is because we're sort of in 2025 we are very much repeating a lot of the mistakes of the mid 80s. So like we're right
Yeah,
back there, we're
yeah,
right back in that Reagan era of politics, only this time. And it's so funny because with these movies it's like this movie, we're back to practical effects, we're back to that grainy, gritty, faded black cinematography style that just looks so good to me.
yeah,
And I know
yeah.
a lot of it is because of nostalgia, but like it just, this movie was shot so exquisitely.
It
But
it really is a beautiful movie, and I think even though it is
yeah,
not the most profound thing, I think it's just worthwhile. Like that's when people ask me about it, I'm like, "Oh yeah, go see it." Like it's much cooler and more fun, I think, than the
yeah,
last couple, which I also
yes,
to our earlier discussion, feel a little more positive about with more distance. But yeah, it's a fun, beautiful movie, and I think you're right about the kind of cocaine '80s second Gilded Age thing. I don't think that ever, from a political standpoint, changed. Like Clinton, far right; Obama, far right, right? Blown up kids in the
yes,
Yemen, deregulating, not doing a damn thing about macroeconomic social issues. But yeah, definitely had a different look and feel, and it was the era of
yeah,
Brooklyn, and it just felt like a different time. So this movie I think is timely in part because right, it feels like we're reliving in that ascendancy of the hard right and the sort of sneering version of power. People
yeah,
coming out as just, well, that techno feudalism is only natural. You must obey your kind of techno corporate masters, and that might have been happening due to basically deindustrialization and big long term economic shifts in and a lot of deregulation, right, deunionization in the global north, in the late '70s into the '80s, and that now you're seeing it again with like the powerlessness of the Obama Biden types, in the center right, to like do anything really about the economy, and so they've
hmm,
just ceded it all over to like these bizarre, basically neo Nazis, and if you're like not a neo-Nazi, then it feels like you're just being told to shut up and let, now it's all AI,
yeah,
right? So it's like, well, the AI is going to kind of tell you, what's up, what your job, your job might be replaced by AI. And if not, you're going to be monitored, surveilled, you're going to return to the office. It feels a little more like the character in Romulus, right? Who's starting off as this
yep,
kind of relatable, just like techno peon. And she gets to the station in part, really, it's about escaping that. That's her choice. I'm going to get away from this, fuck this, I'm out. And so that's how she gets to the Hulk. And that's how that's the inciting incident, and to me, that opening, I do think the movie is good, but it does kind of get worse as it goes. But the beginning was great, like in terms of the
yes.
gritty cinematography, the storytelling. I don't know how much we want to go into spoilers, but again, it's the first like 5-10 minutes really I'm talking about it. It's just
Oh yeah, no, full
beautiful movie.
spoilers, full
Okay,
spoilers for
cool.
this.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it definitely devolves into the action stuff, right? Like so
Yeah,
by the time that you hit third act, we're really just like, from one action set piece scenario to the next, and the sort of the morality of things is a little bit less at play. There's still some stuff, but we're really just playing out the things that we set up in the
it's a
first
little Scooby
two
Doo
acts, right?
yakety sax
Yeah.
running through a spaceship, right? It sort of
Yeah.
loses
Yeah.
the thread of like, why are we doing any of this? It's just, well, to get away from the bad guy, which is fine. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an
Yeah.
action movie at that point. To your point.
And then it follows the Alien and Aliens established convention of the ending wasn't the ending, because
Right.
Alien has, I think, three endings to it, and this one similarly has three endings to it, where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I think we've sorted this out. I think we're good. I think we're good, but not really in this one. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, she's gonna die, but the other girl's gonna be fine. But we know that she took the thing, so we know that the sequel is blah blah blah, right? And you're kind of like, okay, the movie could actually end here, and our
Yeah.
two protagonists die. The one girl gets away, she goes back down to the colony, and the thing spreads, and eventually it becomes an LV-246 or whatever I think is from Aliens. I but then she gets out of it, right? She gets out of that one, and we continue on. And then we get onto the ship, and then it's like, okay, now we're finally safe. Okay, cool. And then as the audience, we're going like, nah, but are we, because she took the stuff, right? And then you get that ending of like, okay, now, like, now we've got to deal with this uh, Promethean xenomorph thing. I don't remember if they ever called them anything in those movies, but those, like, the Titan gigantic
Yeah,
humans,
well, it's the
the
weird question of
engineers,
like
right?
how the hybridization process works. So it's kind of
Yeah.
it's funny again rereading Ultraviolet Grasslands. He uses the idea of I don't know if people are familiar with Lamarck, but Lamarck was Darwin's French rival who had a theory of evolution that was similar but based on different mechanics, and so ultimately very very different if you kind of think it through. So with Darwin, I mean, natural selection is just it's blind, right? This is how we know this is how it actually basically works. So creatures don't adapt, right? You don't adapt in real time. You have
Mhm.
the genes you have. Now we're sapiens, so I'm not talking about humans, but other living things just live their lives, and it happens to be that fitness is based on the environment and whatever genes you have, right? Now with Lamarck, he was thinking that creatures would sort of slightly, push in a direction. Then the example would be giraffes would stretch their necks to get to the better fruit, and over time that would lead to giraffes having longer necks to get to more fruit. So it would have been like a thing that they could have sort of nudged themselves to do, not like in a sapient, like, oh, I choose this willingly, just more like,
Mhm.
naturally they would stretch their necks, and that would change how the sort of muscles and bone work. And so, basically, like, UVG has the idea of the Lamarckian ultra predator, like this kind of MacGuffin, alien monster that's really, it's like the ultimate thing you'd fight, if sort of the beast in this still fleet esque setting, where it just can, become anything, right? And I think Alien, the franchise has that, especially with Prometheus on, where it's sort of saying no matter what is thrown at a xenomorph, it can kind of somehow, it's never super clear to me, but like its whole reproductive cycle changes so it can kind of like merge with your DNA and like become kind of like you but bigger and scarier, which is, on the one hand it sounds really silly, but on the other hand it's just a way to, like you're saying, do these mythic, like tell a mythic sort of vampire
Mhm.
other story. The vampire is a version of the human that has become, given over to the devil, right? It's become a kind of evil version of a human. And here, I think the xenomorph is both like, oh, it's a missile, it's made by Space Halliburton, right? But it's also the vampire. It's also a thing that is human but not human. It can touch you, it can enter you and exit you and take parts of you, but it is not human. It's intelligent, but it has no persona. And I think that is really silly, and like the final ending, right, with like the big space baby monster hybrid guy. I don't To your point, I don't
Yeah.
know what terms
Yeah.
their team would have used, but like, I think it's silly. It just, to me, almost, I have to, again, trying to be generous to it, view it as like it jumps shark and it's just a different subgenre of SF. It goes from sort of harder SF to like action, and then it
Mhm.
ends with that goofy kind of Cronenberg body horror, but not really, in the same genre of body horror as the original movie. And whatever, that's okay. It's just more Alien to contend with.
There's a funny thing that happens with the Alien franchise where that original design of the xenomorph was just so perfect, right? Like Geiger just nailed it. That's it. It conveys everything that we need to know about it. This thing is a deadly killing machine. It is organic and yet somehow engineered and technological. It has metal teeth, but like this transparent skull that you can see, inside of it, like the inner workings of it. It's a real tangible thing, but also somehow like ethereal and part of its environment. Like it just he nailed it with that original design. And then Aliens, it was very smart in going like, nothing really more to do here. Just instead of one, lots, right? But then it does get to the third act and goes, hey, what about a really, really big one?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. Which begins to
But
bring in that Lamarckian, like, okay, so it doesn't just have the one
yeah,
life cycle we learned from Alien. It actually
yeah,
has like something else going on. There's a kind of epicycle that's more confusing, which is I don't think is ever. I know that I'm sure in the comics they've gone into detail, but I think it like
yeah.
any kid could watch me like that doesn't really make sense. That's not how that would work. But you know, again, it's fine. It's still good.
Right. But then you get to the third movie, and in the third movie, we get the xenomorph that gestates inside the dog, right? And that gives
Yeah,
us a slightly different looking xenomorph, which establishes a thing about the lore of the xenomorph, of it like adapting its genetics to whatever the host is, right? And then the subsequent films after the third one take nothing else from the third one. Like this is one of the things that bugs me, because I actually think that the third movie is really, really underrated. I
oh
think that
yeah, I
Alien
think it's
3
great.
is a fantastic film. It's just not what people wanted, right? Um Especially coming off of Aliens. I Because it was neither Alien or Aliens, it was its own thing, but a really, really interesting science fiction film. But the thing that everybody took away from it was this idea of like the genetic uh, uh, adaptation, that genetic sort of mimicry of it, and it took on this thing that was from the Thing, right, that movie, than from the previous Alien films. And so then Resurrection is like, okay, so we're going to hybridize the xenomorph even more with a human being through this process, and they go through a ridiculous science fiction explanation for that. And then Prometheus, brings it back into this other stuff and is like, okay, we're going to show you the sort of proto xenomorphs, and go through that whole thing. And so like I think that everybody is just like trying to make a cooler action figure than the xenomorph. And that's where you get to the end of this movie, and they're like, so what would be even cooler than a xenomorph? And it's like, literally nothing, guys.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
literally nothing. Like what's cooler than a xenomorph? A predator. Not cooler, just cool in a completely different way, right? And so, and or the Terminator, right? Or like Terminator, RoboCop, both awesome, different ways that they're awesome. That's how you do it.
Or
You
the
don't
the
go like,
vampire, werewolf,
yeah,
Megatron, Cell. I mean, you know, Majin Buu. It
yeah,
just becomes a childhood sort of teen boys with, you know, not to gender it, but often, right? In my experience, at least
yep,
at the
yep,
time, you know, you'd have notebooks and you make lists of like the best heroes, the best villains, or something. And it's there's something interesting about nerd culture, sort of broadly, in terms of this sort of. I think like baseball does this, like really in the weeds, like scorekeeping, and people have their different ways of
yep.
interpreting what really it means if a hitter had, you know, a certain whatever you know, percentage thing over his career. And you know, it's, you know, again, getting into kind of debates with your friends about it is part of the fun of the overall sort of meta genre, right, of like nerd stuff. But I think from like I think as an adult and like literati from another perspective, that stuff is really silly, and it gets to
Yep,
like if you think about again Varkalox and Strigoi, right, werewolves and vampires. You don't have Nosfer, you know, you've Dracula, the modern vampire, right? Nosferatu. Okay, Myrna had to do something different. You don't have the third instantiation be Dracula, but this time 4 arms, 6 arms, two
yeah,
heads.
yeah,
It's like laser eyes. It's
exactly.
like, well, I mean, he can already kill you, control your wife's mind or whatever. Like he's already rich. You know, I don't like giving him 6 arms. I guess like physically, if you were gonna like wrestle him, makes him
Yeah,
scarier. But it kind of gets away from the point of it's a story about, you know, hedonism and succumbing to your base desires and what you would do if you kind of made a Faustian bargain and had immortality. And like, you know, and again, it's a story about to some degree, you know, cuckolding and rape and these like really
yeah,
serious other topics that are not about like wrestling monsters, which is like all action movies. If you think about Transformers, like most of the shots that are actions are like wrestling monsters of some form or another. You know what I mean? You
yeah,
can do it in space, you can do it with a mummy. I mean, it's just it's the nature of the narrative structure and the cinematographic structure or whatever of the genre. And again, it's sort of meta genre, like all of these sort of nerdy movies. And I think what Alien and Aliens and Alien 3, all to your point, get right is that they sort of, in different ways, they do a little of that to kind of satisfy the brief, like kind of science action horror, whatever. But they also like try to be more interesting and have other stuff going on.
yeah,
And I think, you know, I just think it's less clear with the modern ones. I think Resurrection's a weird middle point, and then the modern Alien movies, while maybe not horrible, Yeah, it is almost like they're just like, I don't know, maybe like you're saying, it's kind of like, maybe it's a dog, maybe it's a this, maybe it's a, oh, the engineers, maybe it's a sort of like a human, but bad. It's a bad human, and it's just it's like, well, you already had the xenomorph, like you said, guy, Giger nailed it. And you don't need a new form. You need to think about how you encounter it, which I think, again, the first half of Romulus gets so right. It's about the moment of encounter, and
Yeah.
so I think Fede Alvarez does a good job of like realizing that you don't, and then of course he ends up doing all of it because it's this maximalist super movie. It's like six movies in one. But the
Yeah.
first half is really good, where Rain Carradine, the minor, the main character, she just like has to encounter the xenomorph in a way that is really freaking scary, and like that works really well. And after that, it kind of snowballs into all the other versions. But I think it almost highlights the difference. You know what I'm saying about like the kind of mythological dimension, the sort of vampire legend, and then the action movie IP. We're selling this to the foreign market or whatever, right? Like the back half of just like keep throwing darts at the wall. And I'll watch both, but I acknowledge one is much more sort of satisfying because it makes me think deeper things. The other one is just weird eye candy, where afterwards I have more questions from my wife about why something happened that I
Yeah.
also can't explain.
Yeah. Yeah. The first two acts of Romulus really like pose a bunch of interesting questions, and then the third act is action, action, action. I would personally, I would just do away with the whole engineer aspect of it at the
Right,
end.
right.
Like that, like to me, like that is the moment where it's like um I think that it was expertly done, right? Like I think in terms of like tension and creepiness and stuff like that, it is great. But to your point, it takes this weird turn away from the that the xenomorph vampire, like hunting stalking element, and it
Yeah.
turns into a Cronenbergian thing. It's it's the end of the fly,
And it
right?
feels
Like
unearned because I think the motherhood thing, it's almost never actually been done in the movies. Now that I think about Resurrection, it's such an
mhm,
interesting point about you know the female, the powerful female lead as someone who could mother an organism, and then the
yeah,
whole idea of the alien as a parasite that sort of uses human bodies in a sort of grotesque parody of human um, parturition or whatever, right? Like it's a birth thing that is made weird by if you think about who designed it visually, it's like Giger, right? Like the most grody like man dude with a cigar out of his mouth, like designing
yeah,
this. So sort of re-engineering. It's a very Fritz Kahn. Like you hired this weird Swiss engineer to like re-engineer and make disgusting and techno-organic like human birth, and that's the villain in the movie. Is a kind of hijacking of the female form and of the natural cycles of birth, and it kind of gives rise to in the instance of the subject, a parody about that cycle of like natural social reproduction that the movie's setting and the setting of, again, to that meta level, Blade Runner et al. Are also giving rise to at the level of society. So there's sort of a parody of like techno-feudalism is like the worst way that you could do humans socially reproducing themselves. And Alien with a xenomorph is like the worst way that you could do like birth, would be like a
mhm,
thing crawls through your mouth and explodes out of your chest. And it's just like horrible, but it's like, yep, that's life, huh? Beauty and wonder, kind of
yeah,
documentary
yeah.
terms. Um, but I think to your point, yeah, you
Yeah.
can get into it through a darker kind of predator prey story that feels more like horror and is kind of deeper feeling automatically, or you can get to it by like shooting up a weird thing. And they're just different ways in. I don't know now that we're
Yeah.
talking through it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to me because the alien is such a great metaphor for so many things about humanity. I and you can sort of overlay it onto all of these different themes that are in the story. And I love the way that we hate the xenomorph for the thing that we consider to be the most important about sort of humanity, right? And it's like this, it's the way that we talk about parenting and motherhood and reproduction. It's a miracle, and all of these things. And then we look at the xenomorph, which does it, like to your point, in this very like grotesque, violent fashion. And it, I mean, like that has always kind of been part of the point,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's that analogous thing of like, you know I we everything that we're motivated by is as biological organisms is just perpetuating you know the race into the future, immortality in that sense, right? And that whole lesson of it, which I think is part of like the larger narrative of this stuff, because of Prometheus and Covenant,
Yeah.
and the Peter Wayland aspect of it is like this concept of, oh, I'm going to live forever. And at the end of Covenant, when you sort of finally are, it's revealed, or not end of Covenant, Prometheus, that Charlize Theron's character is Wayland's daughter, and that he refuses to die and pass on the legacy to her, right? When the reality is, like, your legacy doesn't die, it continues through your children, right? It
Right. Right.
continues on into the future. And it does, because the legacy is that he's a terrible person and so is she. So it's like, don't worry, man, your legacy is totally there.
And also, it wouldn't matter,
um
right? The board like doesn't care. Like Wayland
yeah,
Yutani is no longer. I mean, it never was probably one person in the way that all these companies are. But yeah, you see it
yeah,
through the human lens. It's a movie, so we sort of have a villain there,
yeah,
a sort of stock, industrialist bad guy. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Prometheus actually does. Again, Prometheus had a lot of the tools to sort of tell the story. Romulus, smartly to your point, doesn't even try to pick those tools up, at least from jump. Like we sort of
yeah,
open with the more claustrophobic, one worker techno peon trying to escape her lot in life. And oops, there's a xenomorph, right? It's like, oops, you've touched the bad MacGuffin, the sort of the One Ring, right? You don't want it, right? It's not good. Um, and I think that really does allow you to later, like, hopefully, if Fede Alvarez is going to keep making these movies, which I take it he will, then the later ones, if they try to pick up those tools, will maybe he and his team will be more intentional about like where they're growing with their critique. Because again, I think it's not enough to have a story where it's like you kind of throw in a techno industrialist and then watch him die and be like, haha, we all got some catharsis from that, right, boys? It's just
yeah.
it doesn't really feel like much of a payoff. It's kind of not that deep. Whereas the whole thing about the unnatural birth element of the xenomorph and its hijacking of human anatomy does feel so like creepy, and it's creepy every time. It's like visceral, like every time you watch it you're like, this is
Yeah.
just creepy as hell. Like like you said, it is just kind of the perfect bad guy design in terms of monsters. I can't think of a monster, and maybe it's again nostalgia, but I don't know, I can't think of a monster I've ever seen that's really beaten the xenomorph for like pure just like creepitude, um
It has the right balance of familiarity and foreignness that
yes, yeah,
that that makes it understandable. We know exactly what it can do and what it's going to do and what its intent is, but at the same time, it is completely alien and foreign to us. It's unyielding. The fact that it has no eyes means that we can't look at it and actually like comprehend it, right? That was actually one of the things that Resurrection, I think, did so smartly, is that alien, the child one at the very end of that film, has eyes, and it's the first time that we see a xenomorph's eyes. It's not technically a xenomorph, it's whatever this hybrid thing
right,
is, right?
right,
But it has the moment, and it punches in on it. Like, it is the purpose of that design, is that Ripley can finally look this monster that she's been fighting, over multiple lifetimes at that point, in the eyes, and confront that shadow, right? Like, it actually served a purpose in that one, as opposed to, like, with this one, it's like it ends up having a human face, and it's this face of the engineer. But to me, it felt that it I think the reason why that the ending in this one doesn't work for me as well as it does in Resurrection is that Resurrection, it's like that's the driving point of the whole film, is
yeah,
to get to that point of her
exactly,
being
yeah,
confronted with this thing. Whereas this one just felt like an MCU, hey, remember that other movie? Which I love in the MCU. Like, that's what I love about the MCU, is like, hey, remember in the Loki show when he said that one thing, and then it happened in this Hulk show, right? And you're like, oh, cool, yeah, I remember, I connected those two things. I'm rewarded for liking both things. But with this one, it was like, and maybe because Prometheus and Covenant aren't quite as successful, so all you're doing is kind of just drudging up some stuff where you're like, I didn't really like those movies that much, right? Or I didn't like that component of it that much. So this thing coming out and looking like one of the engineers, um, but that really not having a point, or
yeah,
not really making a lot of sense. Like there there's a really interesting aspect to this. I watched those two movies over the last, 72 hours, and then watched Romulus, right? had I not watched those movies, had I watched Romulus first, I wonder how much differently I would feel about this ending if I wasn't bringing that baggage in of like, okay, this is, Ridley Scott's like, hey, let me, like, let me cook, guys.
But to push
I got
back,
things to say,
I
right?
think
But
callbacks are meaningless, like not good or bad. They just, whatever.
yeah,
It's an Easter egg. It has nothing to do with the main plot and the catharsis. Like the main emotions you're feeling are not because of the callbacks. Like you said, you as like an
yes,
arch nerd can get some pleasure from them. I'm not denying that. Just that it probably doesn't change. I would say like you're a smart movie watcher and went to film school and all that, right? So like you probably like the movie or not based on the broader like does it have real characters who went through an
sure,
emotional journey
sure,
that feels meaningful, right? So I think to me, you said it really well. Like I think the xenomorph is all about the fact that it's an inhuman thing hijacking the human in the way that the vampire is this dehumanized ex-human, hijacking humanities, hijacking our lifeblood. And I think when you get to this sort of but it can also do this weird Lamarckian thing where sometimes it poops out like a little person who just like is a screamy pale giant instead
yeah,
for some
yeah,
reason. And it's like and not only is it confusing at the level of like the MacGuffin and how it's supposed to work logically in the hard SF. Setting that aside, I also just think to your point, like, well, by giving it a face and making it human, it's now a very different story. It's not about that radical alterity. It's like trying to do some comment on motherhood, body horror thing, but kind of hard to do it because it's not a person and can't talk. Whereas if you think
yeah,
about like Frankenstein and that, so if you could almost compare like the Frankenstein dilemma to that situation, which isn't really a monster, try to avoid it's not a monster, to the vampire, the werewolf, right? So you have the creature, and the creature is like a human you could talk to, right? The creature may look
mhm,
like a zombie, and the creature may have be sort of a Nietzschean like freed from morality person who might kill someone, um, but they're not crazy, right? They're rational in the sense that they know they are a created person who's been abandoned by their creator and they're pissed about it and they have like
yeah,
feelings. So you can have a conversation and be like, creature, let's do some group trauma therapy, like let's think about stuff.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas like you can't do that with like Count Orlok doesn't care, Dracula doesn't care. They're just going to kill you.
yeah,
The
yeah,
xenomorph is not intelligent in that way, doesn't speak, doesn't have signs and symbols. So it sort of feels like a weird problem at the level of genre, like a really high level problem to have sometimes, like usually it poops out this ultimate like predator that cannot speak, that uses your own body and kills you. But sometimes it poops out like, a little dude who just becomes quickly a 9 foot tall dude who like looks like you but wants to kill you. But unclear
yeah,
why, and you can't talk to it. And so it just sort of it feels like a pulled punch where it's like, well, if you were going to do that, then have a version where they're intelligent. But then
yeah,
then again, it opens up this whole other can of worms of like, well,
yeah.
wait. I mean, what do they want? I mean, as far as we know, they're not intelligent. They're almost like missiles, right? They're tools that are not meant to have their own thoughts. They just are meant to kill. That's the only thought. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I think it kind of just becomes confusing at like a really high level when they do that. So that I think for me was beyond. I agree. Like it was shot better than Prometheus. Like it looked cooler, and at
yeah,
least she killed it. I mean, big spoiler
yeah,
there, but and so yay, go Final Girl. But it didn't like mean anything. I don't know. I didn't feel the visceral reaction of even like I don't know, again like a Dead Ringers or something where it's it seems like there's more thought about like why are we using essentially human childbirth in such a visceral way. Like you see all of it at the end of
yeah,
Romulus. So again, trigger warning: if you don't want to watch the very end, don't watch the very end. Stop
yeah.
before the birth scene.
I think one of the things that makes the ending feel discordant is that the earlier elements in the movie set up this parody between these two alternative ways of human beings creating the next step, right? Whether it's the synthetic organisms like the androids, right? Like Andy in this story, or the xenomorphs, which really what we end up discovering in this one is that actually it's kind of Rook who is the one who's like, I'm actually gonna push this to the next stage, and see what happens. And so that creature that
Right.
comes out at the end is the result of Rook trying to intervene in the same way that David did in yeah, it was David. Yeah, David in the
In
previous two
Promethean
films.
Covenant, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's this sort of continuing thing of like actually the thing that is perpetuating the xenomorph and its continued sort of, existential threat to humanity is actually these things that we created, our children, which is the synthetic organism, right? And I guess for me, I think all three of these modern alien films ask the questions and then don't bother to investigate the answers at all, right? And I think that's probably where like all three of them, although I think like are saying really cool things and really interesting things, are falling just short.
Yeah.
The difference with Romulus for me is that Romulus takes it back to the roots and goes like, at the end of the day, the wrapper on this candy bar is this gritty retro 80s future. Wasn't retro at the time that they first made the movie, but subsequently has, in
Well,
40
it
years
it
has
sort of
turned
was. It's
into
calling
retro.
out like Planet of the Vampires, and it's calling out 50s,
Sure, yeah,
60s
yeah,
pulp movies in the design. And Giger
yeah.
again was. These are all weird guys who were looking back at,
Totally.
what's it called, Metropolis, and
Yeah,
they're looking at kind of origin stories of what is now modern SF, right? What has been metabolized into kind of oh, that's just how the future is going to look, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I think
But-
another way to think about it, to your point, is also just like what are like you said, I think Romulus nails that it should be about not necessarily a final girl per se, but a human who has agency over her world, and a human to whom you can relate. A worker, I would say, a worker to whom you can relate. And I
mhm,
think Romulus may not completely stick the landing. It's more like a wobble, but it's a good movie, and it still pretty much start to finish has that perspective on the worker and her journey. Whereas I think,
yeah,
especially Covenant and Prometheus, really fail with that measure. I think they get away from the idea that while this is a myth, yes, the myth is always about the human, right? The myth is a way of storytelling, so, among humans, so among workers, right, among people. And if you look at, you know, the, the the actual myths, like I looked up, so I knew Romulus and Remus as the founders of Rome, right? And they're
mhm,
suckled by a wolf. That's really all I knew. But I looked it up, and they're demigods, right? The whole story, they're the sons of Mars, and they're demigods, and the whole point is to link somehow genealogically, Aeneas and Troy and the sort of Trojans as these victory was stolen from them. They should have won, March Madness kind of civilization. Those
mhm,
dirty Greeks, tricked him with the horse. Who could have seen the horse coming? To link Troy to Italy and to the rise of Rome through this figure of Aeneas, and then okay, later on in his lineage, these kids who somehow found Rome. So all were kind of ridiculous bullshit, but the reason that matters is this kind of nation building. But they're demigods, and specifically they're demigods from really really weird stories. So they're in Plutarch's Lives, there's different accounts, and the very first one is absolutely crazy. So I would like to read it as an aside, because it is very body horrific and very alien. But I will just say all of these stories are the same. They sort of go from the wildest to like the least wild origin story, but they never get an answer. It's not like Mars ever comes down and is like, good job guys. It's like the
mhm,
origin is the weird part, and then the humans have to figure out what to do. And I
mhm,
actually think there's something to that, in that the alien movies kind of presuppose this, novum of the xenomorph, and then the original ones are very focused on like, okay, what would some workers do about it? Ripley on her own, kind of in the first one, and then there's groups of workers in the other ones, and some of them are soldiers. They actually work in kind of across tendencies in politics speak, so they don't necessarily like each other, but they kind of have common cause with like, well, xenomorph's bad, right? And then some of them are actually sellouts who like, like you said, the androids tend to be the bad guys who like, whoops, I'm actually here to like collect xenomorph blood or whatever, not blood,
mhm.
but xenomorph protoplasmic black goo, whatever it is called in
Yeah,
canon. So I think there's something to the idea of like, let the workers fight it out, is more interesting than having the kind of god level. Oh, actually, it's Guy Pearce and bad makeup, and it's like having some sort of weird like behind the closet number one. There's like some super cryo sleeping super god engineer. It's who again like doesn't speak, doesn't we don't get much out of. I mean, he speaks, but we don't really get like a sense of you
mhm,
know, oh, is that guy like into pickleball? Like he's just like
yeah,
another
yeah,
monster. And by throwing more monsters in, more Nova, you just confuse, you kind of dilute the power of the original Novum and the power of watching humans deal with it, which I think is what a lot of sci-fi is about. And frankly, horror often, right? Is you give them one good villain and then a bunch of humans have to deal with it. The more weird shit you throw in, the more it tends toward that Nick Cage B movie, you know, um, not good, not as good horror, right? As opposed to like the
Yeah.
A24, like, wow, that's very profound and scary horror. Um, but yeah, no, the actual legends, as an aside, really weird, really, really weird. Like actual myths, just as weird as anything, um, Alvarez or Scott could have come up with. But
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, anytime you start digging into Greek or Roman mythology, and you're like, wait, I'm sorry, who did what to who, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
and like I'm sorry, what are the gods, what exactly are these gods of?
yeah,
And I think that so much of that is so difficult for us to interpret as having grown up in monotheistic surroundings, right? With that sort of a thing, and not really understanding the purpose of gods, of them being something that is like literary to us, right? And not something
lived, yeah,
belief,
yeah,
or yeah. Whereas, so it's when my girls ask me questions about Greek stuff, like something will come up, a character will be named after some Greek god in something that they're watching, and then they'll be like, what is that? And then I'll start talking about a Greek myth, and then they'll be like, what's that? And it's like only the questions that a 5 and an 8-year-old are going to ask you, that you've never really, or not never really, but have forgotten that you asked when you were a kid, of like, wait a second, like, wait, that doesn't make any sense.
yeah. There's a kind of
You have to
infinite
start.
regressus of just like
Yeah,
weird stuff going on. Yeah,
yeah, totally. But yeah, anytime that somebody puts it always goes one of two ways. Either it just sounded really cool, right? Oh, Romulus just sounds really cool. Or it does ultimately end up becoming like, oh, okay, so there's underpinnings here. There's a reason why they picked that. And yeah, it's a
yeah. You
uh,
have to tie it off. You have to be like, the point of the myth was to blank, right? So like the point of the
yeah.
origin story of Rome is to tie it to a martial culture that had a literary history that could rival the Greeks, because the Greeks were so dominant and had created the whole culture of the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
Um, Along with Phoenicians, Etruscans, whomever, but really in Egyptians. But that for the Latins, they're like kind of starting out with their state and are kind of looking at the Greeks and being like, how do we prove that we're actually like in all ways superior to the Greeks? So there's some myth about it, but then the ways that the details of it are just so zany. And so this is, I think, a good time to just say, this is the original account of, so
Yeah.
how do these kids, so it's all about birth. This is kind of what I'm getting at, and it feels very much tied to Alien, even though that's, the name of the station is probably arbitrary, and Alvarez is just looking at like, what's like a militaristic sounding name, like what's a name that like the US military would pick for this, and like Romulus, that sounds like a cool name, right? Nostromo, also great name, a whole nother discussion, but
Yeah.
Romulus, you could have just go with, yeah, it's like military, right? Romulus, founder of Rome, son of Mars, totally a like secret military black site weapons lab name. But the actual origin story is, so okay, there's a king in what is now, near what will be Rome, named Tarquetius. And there's an oracle who says that, basically the thing happens in his house, which is weird, which is in his hearth, there's a phantom. And so it's translated, Plutarch's term, as a phantom, in the shape of a phallus. So a penis just shows up in his hearth. So in his fireplace, there's just a big ass floating penis. And he goes to an oracle, and the oracle of Tethys in Tuscany says, well, you must find a virgin to have sex with the phantom penis. And she will have your son, and the son will be like surprisingly strong. And so he, of course, is like, he tells one of his daughters, all right, this is your job. You're marrying a phantom disembodied penis. So I swear this is the legend. And then she instead has one of her handmaids do it. And she doesn't want to have sex with a ghost penis. And then he decides that, he waffles on murdering them. In his dreams, a goddess appears and says, no, don't do that. So he imprisons them and has them weave something, and they keep weaving and unweaving it to delay like getting married off or whatever. But the point is that, the mother of the twins, by the phantom, eventually, like when she gives birth, is like, let's kill these kids. Like, this is not good. And then the guy doesn't go through with it, right? He sets them in the woods instead of killing them, and a she wolf saves them. So they're demigods, and they're saved by nature. And then after that, they sort of inherit the kingdom, right? And they end up founding Rome. But so that all stuff, like, okay, they're sort of cast off divine royal sons who come back and like become good kings or whatever. That I knew, but the idea that in the original story, it's because there just happened to be in the king's fireplace a floating penis is like the weirdest thing. And it just
Yeah.
felt very alien that like, there's like this kind of approach of like managing that as like a normal household. Like if you had like an infestation of rats or like a leak in your ceiling, you like
Yeah.
go to the oracle and you're like, what do I do about this phantom? Um, and so there's other stories, there's other versions, but the fact that Plutarch opens with that in such a just like plain, like, I don't know. Now it's all written in this way of like, yeah, some people say, like, I've heard, you can't believe everything the Greeks say, but some people believe this is how, we ended up with Rome.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that ties into the idea of the space station that specifically researches like gross, dangerous body horror, like birth hijacking technology, in a just a very pat way. And I just genuinely did not know that until 2 days ago when I was Googling for this episode. Like, oh yeah, who is Romulus?
That's so funny because it's like no matter how far you keep going back in the lore of the aliens, eventually you get to black goo, right? Like it just like that's in the and so it's like, yeah, you go back, if you go back far enough in the lore, it's just a ghost penis, a disembodied ghost phantom penis in a fireplace. I and it's like that's the same thing as like these vases full of black goo. And I Prometheus, actually, I love it when a movie states its thesis, right? Like when
Oh
a
yeah.
character like steps almost through the fourth wall, like to you, and goes like, by the way, this is what the movie is about. I like it when a movie does it artfully, like when Jeff Goldblum states the thesis of Jurassic Park in
Oh yeah.
the around the dinner table, right,
It's a
right
great
before
example.
everything's about to turn into an action movie. To me, it's the best example because it's such like it's treated almost expositorily, but it is actually thematic, right? But
Yeah.
with this franchise, because of Prometheus, um, Logan Marshall Green's character states the unintended thesis of Prometheus in that film when I think he's talking to David and he's like, I've found them, and we did what we came here to do, sort of thing. It's like, well, you came to talk to your creators, only to find out that they're mortal as well. And it's like, so, then where did they come from, sort of thing. And it's like you said, it's this recursive thing of like, okay, so then there isn't an answer. Like the answer to the answer is that there is no answer, and that you're just going to keep looking for God, like further and further and further and further into it. And
Yeah.
to me, that's the same thing of like, if you ask, where did the xenomorphs come from? Here's an explanation of a series of events, of a plot line that led to the xenomorph, like capital X xenomorph, right? But like, where did the xenomorphs come from? Black goo. What's the black goo? Bad?
Yeah.
It's bad
Yeah.
stuff. It's bad stuff. The one guy drinks it at the beginning of Prometheus, and then he starts crumbling for some reason and falls down a waterfall. The movie never goes back and explains what the hell that was about. It was just like, uh, okay, right?
Yeah, I mean, is
And
that meant to
yeah,
be a kind of moment of quiet, like I, the engineer, my species, we can live forever, and this is like at some point you choose. It's almost like the Good Place. You choose the quiet death. You
yeah,
end
yeah,
eternity, you end suffering, and even just the suffering of the cognitive burden of decision making and the feeling of agency. Or is it some other thing? Is it a falling on your sword thing? Is it a no? I'm going to give birth to a new world and sacrifice my body into to your point, it's never explained. It's a very memorable cow catcher because it's so weird and feels to me very dissonant with the rest of the Alien franchise. It doesn't feel like hard SF. It feels more like cosmic fantasy.
yeah.
Um, More like when I don't know, like Deadpool is standing outside of time and space talking to Death, and she's like his like lost lover or whatever in the comics, and it doesn't really like make sense given like the scale of like normally he's like walking around a city like punching guys. And I think there's definitely something to Prometheus and Covenant, especially, and just touches of it in Romulus that can't decide, what genre we're in. And kind of like
Yeah.
Resurrection, as you said, and definitely AVP. When you cross the genres, you sort of raise these questions of like, is this just a bigger action movie, which would kind of make sense, or is there some larger scale thing at stake? And I think to your point, and this is getting, again, forgive me if I'm getting overly quote unquote deep or whatever on your podcast, but this is just, again, I'm an unfrozen
Not at
caveman
all.
and I know this stuff better than I know pop culture. But um it's like henotheism. We were just talking with Dr. Erica Bridges on Why We Roll about her game inspired by Greek and Roman myth, and TTRPGs and trying to understand like real beliefs in gods that are aspects of the natural world that are not like different people. They're like different personas of one unified nature. And that is a very different way of understanding being. And you know, in some ways it might sound, oh, that sounds closer to, the Abrahamic, like monadistic, like there's one God, right? Like idea, and everything is that God, and the God can kind of appear to you or you can understand in different ways, but it's one thing. But I think in some ways it's very different. It's closer to what, I'd call like process philosophy or Buddhism, or the idea of like infinite change. And then, there's a sort of Heraclitean element in understanding a world in which every time you interact with something, there's going to be sort of specific rules to that interaction. And I think that's true in a biophysical sense. I think it's true when you look at the oracles and all of these examples. For example, just looking at Plutarch of, well, I have this problem, I need a specific answer. I go to a specific temple of a specific god and get a specific ritual I have to do. And that
Mhm.
gives rise to a specific series of events of these sort of Coen brothers esque just shitbaggery with trying to drown little kids who end up always getting saved in every version. There's like 15 versions and they always become the kings and found Rome. So it sort of feels like, if you live in that process universe, then the problem of the xenomorph and the infinite regressus and who made it and all that stuff doesn't matter. And it kind of goes away. It becomes a background because the xenomorph, like the vampire, it's like a shadow of the human. It's a shadow of
Mhm.
stuff we do. It's this techno organic weapon that is a bad thing that shouldn't exist, that of course people will try to keep doing and keep controlling. And we, the workers, the people we associate with in the story, the protagonists, they have to decide what to do about that. And if you try to then unpack the lore and explain it, and to your point, Prometheus kind of tries to do this the most in the movies, it just always feels unfulfilling because it's not supposed to be a one to one. It's not a world in which there is like a real explanation here. It's a myth. And it's a myth about change and about things that do and don't change. Everything about it changes, but the structure doesn't change, right? We would always have bad bosses who want to exploit dangerous things and pollute our environment, and we have to rise up against them. That's one way to interpret the Alien franchise as such. Um, and the things themselves, the bioweapons, are horrible, but they are like a shadow or reflection or an outcome of a structure, that's in place. And I think trying to like get really into the weeds of the lore or the canon, to me, it generally is less satisfying, but especially here, where I
Mhm.
think we're more in that mythological horror mode and less in hard sci-fi in terms of like the expanse, what ifs about humanity taking to the stars, if that makes sense. Like, not that that's
Yeah.
not an Alien, it's just not the point of Alien. It's not
Yeah.
really a movie about like, moving to another planet. It's just really about, you and your bosses, and what if what if the xenomorph was a thing you had to work with, and that's a working hazard you didn't really understand when you took the job.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. I mean, like I think that you and I could probably just talk about this into infinity. Um, I don't know. At some point we got to wrap it up,
No, no,
right?
we should call it. It's three. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's been great, Michael, and
but
thanks for having me. Sorry again if I've been long-winded
no,
or
it's
academic, but
no. It's all
you opened a
that's the
can of
thing is that
worms.
like this is this is exactly what we do, right? We did Prey earlier this season,
Oh, I loved
which
Prey.
I think
Yeah.
is awesome because we've got sort of it was the second episode of the season. We brought Missy on, and Missy is a folklore and fairy tale expert,
Oh, awesome.
and so she is digging into all the same sort of stuff that you're digging into, and yeah, that's exactly my aim here is, we talk about the passion for the thing, this why we love it, but then ultimately it ends up getting into these very sort of heady conversations about where these myths and ideas come from in the first place. So no, it's all exactly, but to my point, we could just do it forever. We could just talk about this franchise forever. So regardless of the quality of Prometheus and Covenant, I think if anything, from a franchise perspective, from a mythology perspective, even, it's like, well, they might be messy. They might not nail it exactly, but they do ask some questions that I think a future film could probably answer. And to the point of future alien stuff with Fede Alvarez, he said recently that he would love to do AVP, coming off of this, but that if he did it, he would want to do it in conjunction with Dan Trachtenberg, who directed Prey. And I read that and was like, that's the answer to the question. That's what we need to do. Maybe not next, maybe more alien movies. We've got more predator movies coming out this year, or within the next 12 months, I think. But I think there's two of them coming. But um that future, that ultimate future of the two of them teaming up to do Alien and Predator, and like, directing it together as a tag team, I think is just such a it's there's novelty in it that gets me excited, because I want to see how those
Sure.
two directors bounce off of each other, because Prey is such an interesting, thoughtful film, and then
Yeah.
Romulus is like very visceral, very like, and it's almost, I almost feel like those two directors have almost like swapped spots in terms of like their individual franchises, that like these alien movies were going into like this really weird, heady, mythological, magical space, and then Fede Alvarez comes along and he's like, let's get it back to the alien killing things and acid blood being cool, right? And then you've got Dan Trachtenberg over here going like, these Predator movies have always just been action, 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 and they got worse and worse and worse. What if we actually stopped and thought about this for a second and made it an analogy for something new,
Yeah.
with colonialism or whatever?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like,
with
yeah, okay,
yeah, the metaphor there is really important. I mean, I think
yeah,
the movies were going away from mythology, to my point about process philosophy, and toward a very silly, just action movie, scattershot.
oh yeah,
Is how about this? How about that kind of approach? And I think
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Romulus gets them back to the core again, the first half at least, the core myth of the sort of the living weapon stalking you in the shadows, and what
Yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
represents, and your represents about your role as a laborer. What I'd like to see, to the Trachtenberg point, would be the next Alien movie, whether it's with Trachtenberg or not, but just being about a worker who, like Ripley, has now learned to take on with more agency a role in the story of the xenomorph, and
Yeah,
of this kind of, whatever we want to call it, sort of mythology of the future of sort of techno feudalism and bioweapons and stuff. Because one thing with Romulus is it does feel like she's just running away the whole time, which fair enough. I mean, it's kind of set up that way, and the acting is fine and all that. But I would love to see the next movie step up, and whether that involves predators or not, I think it's a natural progression, right? Is to have the next Alien movie be about kind of a worker um, taking a stand and doing a thing actively, in the way that Prey very much is about people reacting to the presence of the predators with choice and with intention. And I think that's one
yeah,
movie that's successful. That's one of the reasons. But yeah, no,
totally.
that I'm like you. I'm hopeful as far as these are like big dumb action movies that I will watch on a plane or whatever. Like, I will keep watching them, and I'm hopeful for
Yeah,
them. Separately, unrelatedly, I'm going to keep making sci-fi inspired by them, or really inspired by their much earlier instantiations, which maybe largely that's
yeah,
nostalgia. But yeah, I appreciate talking to you about it, and I look forward to hopefully continuing to make some sci-fi game stuff with you as well. So I think
yeah,
it's a fruitful. Speaking
absolutely.
of fruitful collaborations,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I Hey, if people want to follow you on the internet, where can they do that? What's the best way to do it?
so I would say follow my company everywhere at Stillfleet. So Blue Sky, we're active on. Instagram, we're active on at Stillfleet. Our website is stillfleet.com. So really simple. And as Michael has previously said, you can go to stillfleet.com/enter, and that will take you to the campaign for Enter the Nostalgiatron, which is the new full quick start and venture with art and story by Michael Cohen, and graphic design, etc. And I wrote some words and did some mechanics, and helped sort of product design it. And we have a bunch of other great goodies, and there's some free stuff you get if you back us and our partners over at Spicy Tuna RPG. Marco Serrano has a new game called Blackthorn. That's a pulp game. So pulp horror as opposed to sort of pulp sci-fi. We're doing a little team up. Yeah, and in terms of the future of Stillfeet Studio, we have a bunch of fun things going on, but I'll just shout out, we have a card game coming out called Yoink Boink that's about going to radical hell. So it's sort of like if you're in a Sisyphean like hell, where you keep getting thrown down in a giant pit full of crap. But you're like a rad skater dude, so you're just like having a fun excite bike like skater card game journey. And it's really fun. It's a fun, fast play, easy to learn game with just amazing art by Anthony Grasso, who did Blister Critters. We also have our third big RPG with the grid system coming out this year called Danse Macabre by Christopher Pickett, and that is a very dark OSR adjacent, history inspired game where you are some sort of medieval person, no magic, fighting hordes of sort of zombie mutants. And it is great. It is really well written and beautifully illustrated. So very different from Stillfleet, but we always have a few games kind of in the hopper. Definitely check out Stillfleet if this all intrigues you. If you like RPGs, if you like sci-fi, stillfleet.com/enter. And Michael, thanks so much for having me on. Perfect 10 is great, so I'm just chuffed to be able to yammer about Plutarch. So
Yeah, no, it was excellent. This was an excellent conversation, and I'm sure that everybody had a great time and learned some stuff, and hopefully is now intrigued to go check out more of Stillfleet. And yeah, whether it's the core game or jumping in with us at entering the Nostalgiatron and having some 80s cartoon fun with it. Yeah, I think that the people who listen to this podcast in particular will probably get some value out of all aspects of that. So definitely check it out. And that's my biggest thing to tell people to go check out right now. Other than you can go to patreon.com/thunderquack to support the podcast. But at the moment, yeah, Enter the Nostalgiatron is everything. It's my whole world. Everything else is just a distraction. So with that, thank you so much, Wythe, for hanging out and talking Alien with me. It was super fun.
oh, my pleasure.
And yeah. And thank you everybody for listening to Thunderquack Perfect 10. You can join the conversation on our Discord server over at thunderquack.com/Discord. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast service and leave a rating and review. Until next time, remember, it's not about the score, it's about the love. Stay frosty. Thunderquack Perfect 10 is hosted by me, Michael Cohen. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at TQPerfect10 and join the community at thunderquack.com/Discord. This podcast is supported by listeners just like you over at patreon.com/Thunderquack. Head over there to get early access to episodes, exclusive podcasts, and more. This show is a part of the Thunderquack Podcast Network. Head over to thunderquack.com for more great shows. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.